Lots of people remember their history lessons from school as dates and battles, kings and queens, facts and figures. But the story of our past is open to interpretation, and much of British history is a carefully edited and even deceitful version of events. You might think that history is just a record of what happened. Actually, it's not like that at all. As soon as you do a little digging, you discover that it's more like a tapestry of different stories woven together by whoever was in power at the time. In this series, I'm going to debunk some of the biggest fibs in British history. In the 17th century, politicians and artists helped turn a foreign invasion into the triumphal tale of Britain's glorious revolution. Hello! Woohoo! In the 19th century, a British government coup in India was rebranded by the Victorians as the civilizing triumph of the empire. And in this episode, I'll find out how the story of the Wars of the Roses was invented by the Tudors to justify their power, and then immortalised by the greatest storyteller of them all. Shakespeare presented this as the darkest chapter in the nation's history.
Now is the winter of our discontent.
Two rival dynasties, the House of Lancaster and the House of York, were locked in battle for the crown of England. This was the real-life Game of Thrones. Brothers fought against brothers. Anointed kings were deposed, and innocent children were murdered. Never before had the country experienced such treachery and bloodshed. In 1485, a wicked king, Richard III, was slain, and Henry Tudor took the throne. Henry's victory would herald the ending of the Middle Ages and the founding of the great Tudor dynasty. It was to be England's salvation. Or so the story goes. With history, the line between fact and fiction often gets blurred. In 1455, the village of Stubbins in Lancashire was the scene of a legendary battle in the Wars of the Roses. The fighting began with volleys of arrows, but then, to their horror, both sides realised that they'd run out of ammunition. In desperation, the Lancastrians grabbed some makeshift weapons they happened to have a supply of their local delicacy, black puddings from Bury. And with these, they pelted the Yorkists. But as luck would have it, the Yorkists had their own supply of missiles, Yorkshire puddings, with which they bombarded the Lancastrians. Now, most disappointingly, this 15th century food fight never really happened. It's a local legend that was conjured up as long ago as 1983. But what the Battle of Stubbins Bridge does tell us is that although the dates and the details might be hazy, the Wars of the Roses are still alive and well in what you might call our national memory. What you think you know about the Wars of the Roses, though, and what really happened are two quite different things. According to the history books, the Wars of the Roses is the story of the fatal rivalry between the House of Lancaster and the House of York, between the Red Rose and the White. But the saga of a country divided by 30 years of bloody wars and deadly hate was largely invented by the Tudors, then spun into the dynasty's foundation myth by the greatest storyteller of all, William Shakespeare. And there is a firm basis for this tale of devastating national conflict. On a single day in 1461, the bloodshed was only too real. In the middle of a snowstorm on the 29th of March in Towton, Yorkshire, the Lancastrian and Yorkist forces clashed head to head. The result was utter carnage. The Lancastrians started out the day pretty well, but then the tide began to turn against them. They were chased by the Yorkists down this steep and icy slope. The blizzard was still blowing, and that little river at the bottom was flooded, so they couldn't get any further. This meant that the Yorkists came down the hill and started massacring them. So many men died that their blood stained the snow red. So this became known as the Bloody Meadow.
A century later, William Shakespeare would depict the battle as a medieval Armageddon, where fathers slaughtered their own sons and sons murdered their own fathers. Towton had come to symbolise a country torn apart by war.
The scale of the killing was so great that there's been nothing else quite as bad in the whole of our history. On the first day of the Battle of the Somme in July 1916, 19,000 British soldiers were killed. But here at Towton, contemporary reports talk about 28,000 dead. That's 1% of the entire population killed on a single day.
"20 years ago, Bradford University's archaeology department revealed the true barbarity of the fighting when they uncovered the remains of 43 men killed at Towton.
George, we've got 5 skulls of people here on the table. How was this gentleman finished off here? It's kind of square.
That is with a horseman's hammer. But this particular skull has another sign of extreme violence inflicted with a pole axe. The head was forced down into the spine, so the skull has actually shows signs of splitting. This sort of desecration of the body, that's actually robbing them of life in the next life. You're disfiguring them and they can't be resurrected.
This battle is truly horrendously brutal. But is it the norm for the Wars of the Roses?
No, it was exceptional. Certainly in the enormous number of people who fought and died at Towton.
I think people might have the impression that they were just fighting for decade after decade after decade. But within this period, how many battles actually were there?
Well, there were skirmishes, but in terms of real battles, around about 8.
The feud between the houses of Lancaster and York did fester for 3 decades. But the idea that this was a period utterly ravaged by all-out war, well, that's just historical fiction.
Yes, Towton was a truly brutal battle, but it was also unique. The other battles in the Wars of the Roses had much lower death tolls. And the idea that the country was totally consumed by war is wrong. Some historians argue that out of the 32 years of the Wars of the Roses, the fighting only lasted for a total of 13 weeks. That would mean that there were months, years, even a whole decade when England was at peace.
The reason we talk of this era as the Wars of the Roses isn't an accident. It's the story told by the winning side, the history the Tudors wanted us to remember. It began with their account of the battle that brought the war to an end, the Battle of Bosworth. The Lancastrian Henry Tudor emerged as a victorious hero who'd ended 30 years of bloodshed. He'd saved the nation from a villainous tyrant, the Yorkist King Richard III. The Tudors made sure Bosworth would be remembered as the ultimate clash between the forces of good and evil. Helped along by William Shakespeare, who relished their juicy tale, the battle has been so mythologized that it's hard to sort fact from fiction.
Historians used to think that the Battle of Bosworth took place about 2 miles away, over there, up on top of the hill. But over the last 10 years, all sorts of interesting finds have been emerging from the fields immediately here. That's things like parts of 15th century swords and badges and about 40 of these fantastically deadly-looking cannonballs. The battle must have taken place here. Now, despite this confusion about its location, a myth, a legend has grown up about exactly what happened that day. It's one of our great national stories, and it goes something like this.
King Richard III goes into battle wearing a crown, symbol of what's at stake that day.
Richard declares, "This day I will die as king, or I will win." And even his enemies admit that he fights courageously.
Richard gets within a sword's length of Henry Tudor, but the enemy forces overwhelm him. In desperation, he cries out, my horse, my kingdom for a horse."
And then he's killed with a blow to the head, and he loses his crown.
After Henry's victory, Richard's crown is discovered in a hawthorn bush, and Henry is crowned with it on the battlefield.
Now, how much of this really happened? It's impossible to say. But the reason that this is the story we know is because it's the one Henry wanted us to remember.
Henry wanted to make everyone aware of his decisive victory on the battlefield, but that was the easy part. In a nation divided, Henry's enemies still believed that he was a usurper who'd stolen the crown from the anointed King Richard III. Henry needed to legitimise his new reign, so when his first parliament met a few months after Bosworth, he made sure that it was his version of events that was recorded.
One telling detail that Henry had written into the records of Parliament was that his reign had begun on the 21st of August, 1485. Now, this is a bit odd, because the Battle of Bosworth wasn't until the 22nd of August, 1485. Was this a slip of the quill? No, it was deliberate. Henry was claiming that he'd already been king, even before the battle. So he wasn't a usurper stealing the crown. He was just taking what was rightfully his. He cunningly realised that his success didn't just lie in victory on the battlefield. It also lay in the way that the history of the Wars of the Roses would be written.
Henry's next move was equally cunning. On the 18th of January, 1486, Henry VII married Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV. Henry would present his match as the start of a glorious new chapter in the nation's history.
Henry realised that picking the right wife was important, but that telling the right story about the marriage was even more so. The story that he wanted to tell was that this was one of the most important marriages in history. Here he was, a Lancastrian, marrying Elizabeth, a Yorkist. They were going to heal the nation. They'd once been bitter rivals, but now they were loving bedfellows. But his cunning storytelling had another advantage too. It glossed over the very inconvenient fact that an awful lot of people thought that he had no right to the throne at all.
Henry hoped that his marriage to Elizabeth would be seen as a fresh start. It would also divert attention away from his less-than-royal lineage.
This is a genealogical roll showing the kings of England going right back into the mists of time. It goes back as far as Brutus, the mythical king 1,000 years before the Romans. You can't even see Brutus because he's still rolled up. We couldn't fit the whole thing onto the table. And as you come down this end towards me, you move forwards into the period of the Wars of the Roses. These circles contain pictures of all the different kings, most of them called Edward. This one's called Rex Ted, which pleases me. As we get down here, we have some Henrys. Henry VI, here's another Edward, here's Richard III, and then the main red line peters out. Where is the next king, Henry VII? Well, he's been squished in at the side as the husband of Elizabeth of York. So where's he popped up from? This black line tells us. It goes back to Henry's grandmother, Catherine, who was a proper Queen of England, but her second husband, Henry's grandfather, was this chap, Owen Tudor, a servitor in camera. That means a chamber servant, or in other words, a bit of rough. This family tree reveals Henry's dirty secret. The fact that his claim to the throne was decidedly dodgy. It won't surprise you to learn that the scroll belonged to a family who didn't like Henry, the De la Poles. They were plotting against him. The document also explains why he had to marry Elizabeth. She really was royal. She was the daughter of a king, whereas Henry himself was just the grandson of a servant. But this isn't the tale that Henry would tell us if he were here. He didn't present his marriage as a matter of political expediency. He described it as an extraordinary act of reconciliation.
Henry made his marriage, the union of the houses of York and Lancaster, into the centerpiece of a super successful propaganda campaign to secure his new dynastic ambitions.
This really beautiful book is a medieval anthology of poetry, prose, and advice for educating a prince. But it's best known for its wonderful illustrations, including this one at the Tower of London. This particular picture has a coat of arms, and these two creatures are very curly-haired lions. They're black now because they've tarnished, but they were once silver, and they were the silver lions of King Edward IV. They show that this book was once in his library.
The Yorkist King Edward won the throne in 1471 after defeating his Lancastrian opponents.
This time in the border, we have got red and white roses representing the House of Lancaster and the House of York and their rivalry in progress at the time, the Wars of the Roses. The odd thing, though, about this illustration is that during the actual time of the Wars of the Roses, when this manuscript was first produced, the red rose had nothing at all to do with the House of Lancaster. The border was changed. It was added in at a later date by Henry VII himself. He was the one who adopted the red rose as the House of Lancaster's symbol. And now, look at this. Adopting the red rose for Lancaster was only the first stage of Henry's iconographical plan, because now he could combine it with the white rose of his wife, Elizabeth of York, to create the multicoloured Tudor rose. Normally, the inner petals are white and the outer petals are red. This one happens to be quartered, but you get the general idea. It's red and white together. And so this new Tudor rose became the symbol of the new Tudor dynasty. And it was such a powerful symbol that it allowed Henry VII to completely revise history.
The rose became Henry VII's logo, shorthand for the story of how he'd heroically united a divided nation. Over time, he made it the universally recognised symbol of Tudor might. Across the country, from books to buildings, Tudor roses started to bloom. In Cambridge, Henry made King's College Chapel into the backdrop for one of the most overwhelming displays of Tudor propaganda.
Anna, this chapel was begun by Henry VI, but he didn't finish it, did he?
Well, the chapel had been being built for quite some time, but then the Wars of the Roses happened, resources got diverted, and so when Henry VII became king, it was unfinished. It looked nothing like this, none of this beautiful vaulted ceiling. It was makeshift, it had a sort of timber ceiling, and it was very much a sort of work in progress, and really was much more of a sort of blight on the landscape than anything that made a great statement of power.
But in 1508, Henry VII gave the chapel a much-needed cash injection.
Now this is a bit different, isn't it?
Henry died the following year, but his financial backing ensured that the chapel was completed and decorated according to his Tudor vision.
It's fantastic. I mean, it's the story, really, of Henry VII's journey to the throne. It's his claim to the throne. We have the greyhound, which is the symbol of Margaret Beaufort, his mother. We have the dragon, highlighting Henry's Welsh descent. And we have, of course, Tudor roses everywhere.
They look like they're on steroids. What kind of chemicals have they been treated with to make them so juicy and enormous? They look like cabbages.
It's Tudor chemicals, isn't it? It's the sort of vitality, the virility of the Tudors. And, of course, above the Tudor rose, you see the crown. So, again, it's underlying, these are now royal symbols.
This is Henry saying, game over.
Yeah.
Now it's the Tudors all the way.
And really, I would argue that it's almost like one of the first sort of ubiquitous brands that people across the country, you know, identify with. They know the Tudor brand, they know the Tudor rose. It's all about propaganda, it's all about myth-making. But I think, you know, we're still talking about it, so it was hugely successful.
With control of the crown, Henry also controlled the narrative. In the emerging Tudor tale of the Wars of the Roses, Henry was the conquering hero. And, not surprisingly, the historians during his reign all agreed.
This book is called The History of the Kings of England.
And it's the work of an exceptionally unreliable narrator.
Written by John Rouse, who is an antiquary and historian. And he's writing it during the reign of Richard III, but he actually finishes it after Henry VII has become king.
John Rouse has written this book for his new boss, Henry VII. What's he got to say about him?
He talks about Henry being such a good king that he will be remembered for generations to come. Future executives for many centuries, he will be remembered.
Rouse started writing this book when Richard III was still the boss. What does he have to say about Richard III?
John Rouse isn't very complimentary about Richard at all. And in fact, let's look at the passage where he describes Richard's own birth.
OK.
It says that he had been in his mother's womb for 2 years. He was born cum dentibus, with teeth. Et capillis ad humerus. So
that's hair to the shoulders.
Essentially to his shoulders.
Very hairy. And then there's this slightly mysterious word that could be talons.
With talons, which is quite creepy, isn't it?
That's very monstrous.
And then it says he was born under the sign of Scorpio, and he continued to behave in life like a scorpion.
This is a really striking vilification of Richard III. Is this the first one? Does it all start here?
Essentially, yes. The demonisation of Richard is taking place here. And in fact, later down on this particular page, Rouse accuses Richard of committing several murders, including the murder of his own wife, the murder of his nephews, and also the fact that he had killed with his own hand Henry VI.
What do you think Rouse's motives were for writing this history in this particular way?
John Rouse is writing specifically in order to praise the new King of England, Henry VII. He was only writing what he expected his readers would want to read.
Demonising Richard, when you're now ruled by his arch-rival Henry, was certainly sensible. And Tudor historians onwards went to town. Richard III was said to be malicious, wrathful, and envious as a king. He was also a lump of foul deformity, ill-featured of limbs, and hard-favoured of visage. As Rouse reveals, telling the truth was less important than pandering to the right master.
At an earlier stage of his career, he'd written other works in which he praised Richard III instead. This document is called The Rouse Roll, and John Rouse actually made it for presentation to Anne Neville, who was the wife of Richard III.
We've got the same historian, John Rouse, writing just 3 years earlier.
While Richard III is still King of England. This is Richard himself, and in fact, he's described here as the most mighty Prince Richard, King of England and of France, and Lord of Ireland. And then it goes on to say that he got great thank of God and love of all his subjects, rich and poor, and great love of the people of all other lands about him.
So this couldn't be any better, really. He's a fantastic king. He's doing a great job and everybody loves him. And physically, he's not what I was expecting at all.
There's no sign of a hunchback here at all, is there?
No, he's the perfect knight, in fact. He's wearing his armour. He's got rather a lovely face. He's got beautiful curly hair, although it's in a bit of a pudding basin, which isn't my favourite hairstyle.
He's actually depicted more as a Renaissance prince rather than the deformed caricature that we know of from the works of Shakespeare.
So, Julian, we've got two very contrasting pictures of Richard III from the same historian. Where does the truth lie?
Well, who knows where the truth actually lies, but what we can say is that John Rouse was writing in order to gain the favour of the people who are actually paying him.
That's really depressing. We can't believe historians.
You can never believe a historian.
Well, tell that to the Tudors, because Henry and his historians' dodgy stories were unshakable. When Henry VII died in 1509, and his son Henry VIII succeeded him, the new Henry didn't abandon his father's dynastic founding myth. Far from it, he embraced the tale and made it his own. Unlike his father, the new King Henry hadn't had to fight for his crown, and there were no questions over his right to rule. But he still emblazoned the dynasty's new symbol, the Tudor Rose, onto one of the country's most formidable institutions, the Yeoman of the Guard. I think I might have a better codpiece than you.
I think you might do.
Alan, I'm clearly wearing the trousers of a muscular giant, like yourself. When were the Yeomen of the Guard formalised as a body of men?
Well, that was after the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. Henry VII, of course, defeated Richard at that battle, and having defeated him, of course, was pretty much worried for his own safety.
Yeah.
And so then formed up to 300 Yeomen of the Guard.
Henry VIII adopted his father's yeoman guards and increased their number to 600. When Henry appeared on important occasions, he'd be surrounded by this magnificent troop. Show me my Tudor version. Henry also introduced the yeoman's iconic scarlet uniform, and a modern version of it is still worn today.
And you're going to slip into something equally comfortable yourself.
Yes, I am. One arm in.
Now, let's discuss our chests.
OK.
On my chest, I've got a Tudor rose, but it's going to become the Rose of England.
It is indeed.
It's still there 500 years later. This is a symbol that's really endured, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And that's a very fancy thistle.
Introduced when King James VI of Scotland became James I of England. Of course, over here, the shamrock, which was introduced on the Act of Union.
So you have the whole of the United Kingdom on your belly.
We do. Superb.
Are we ready for our photo opportunity?
Indeed.
Under Henry VIII, the Tudor Rose went from being the symbol of one royal marriage to an emblem for the whole nation. This Tudor Rose has been an incredibly powerful and long-lasting symbol. You'll still find it today representing England on the Queen's coronation dress, on the Duchess of Cambridge's wedding dress, and you might even find it in your pocket because it's still on for 20p. Henry VIII had nailed down his father's version of the story of the Wars of the Roses. By the middle of the 16th century, the people who'd experienced the wars had pretty much all died, but the story was still alive. And when Elizabeth I came to the throne in 1558, her grandfather's myth-making proved incredibly useful.
Ah, here I am in my younger days. This is Elizabeth I's coronation portrait. She's wearing all the trappings of majesty. She's holding her orb and sceptre, and she's wearing ermine, the royal fur. But this picture glosses over the fact that Elizabeth's coronation was a bit of a touch-and-go affair. The problem was that she was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the product of a marriage that had been declared null and void. You could argue that she was illegitimate. This was such a big problem that it was actually quite hard to find a bishop willing to anoint her. Right at the start of her reign, Elizabeth had to assert her right to rule. And she did so in the same way that her father Henry VIII and grandfather Henry VII had done before her. If you look closely at her magnificent gold coronation robe, you'll see that it's embroidered with the Tudor rose. She herself was treated as the living embodiment of the Tudor rose. The poet Edmund Spenser even describes how in the royal cheek, the red rose was melded with the white.
In almost every respect, Elizabeth brilliantly delivered on the promise of her predecessors. But as the decades passed, she failed to produce an heir. And without that heir, Elizabeth's subjects were haunted by spectres of a horribly familiar past.
As the country faced an uncertain future in the 1590s, the memory of the Wars of the Roses took on a new meaning. People started to worry that when the Queen died, there might once again be civil war, with rival claimants fighting for the crown. History might repeat itself.
At the end of the 16th century, the history play transformed Tudor fibs into compelling fiction. For the nation's greatest playwright, William Shakespeare, The Wars of the Roses had all the ingredients for drama. And with his Machiavellian plots and his murderous villain, he wrote the conflict's definitive script.
Henry VI, Part 1, was the first of Shakespeare's plays covering the wars, and it proved a very palpable hit. One of the play's best-known scenes is set in the gardens of Inner Temple, one of the inns of court. It's the very start of the conflict, and the leading nobles are deciding which side to fight for, red or white. Richard, Duke of York, is going to challenge the King, Henry VI, for the crown. And he tells his supporters to pluck a white rose. The Duke of Somerset, who's on the King's side, he tells his supporters to pluck a red rose. A bleeding rose, he calls it. And at the end of the scene, the Earl of Warwick prophesies the bloodshed to come. This brawl today in the Temple Garden, he says, shall send between the red rose and the white 1,000 souls to death and deadly night. The scene became famous because it neatly turned the messy reality into a straightforward struggle between red and white. And it went on to inspire an Edwardian painting, which is one of the war's most celebrated images. This floral, phony war preceding the actual fighting didn't really happen. But nevertheless, you'll see pictures of it in history books. And that's because Shakespeare's fictional version of the Wars of the Roses is such a good story, it's so powerful, that it trumps the truth. From John Rouse's character assassination of Richard III onwards, Shakespeare found his history books packed with tales of the conflict. They were ripe for recycling. After Henry VI, Parts 1, 2, and 3, came one of his masterpieces, Richard III. Andrew, this is an early, very early, collected edition of Shakespeare's works, and it's split into the comedies and the tragedies, but then also the histories. Is that a new category of play?
There have been history plays before, but Shakespeare's one of the first writers who writes a sustained number of histories. The Henry VI plays are blockbusters. Parts 2 and 3 are written first, and they are so popular that Part 1 is then written afterwards. It's the first kind of trilogy that we have surviving.
So is a history, it's not funny, it's not sad, it's a bit of both?
So you can do what you want with a history depending on what the facts tell you.
You don't have to stick to the facts,
You don't
goodness
quite
me.
have to stick to the facts, no, that's
How
right.
old-fashioned of you. How does Shakespeare go about taking history and turning it into fiction? What's his method?
Shakespeare's very much a magpie. He uses bits and pieces from history as he wants to. He uses chronicles like Holinshead, which is one of the most important of Tudor chronicles that shows the triumph of the Tudors.
Sometimes you can catch him in the act of being inspired by these histories, can you?
Oh, certainly. There's this passage which describes Richard III. He was small and little of stature. So was he of body greatly deformed, the one shoulder higher than the other. His face small, but his countenance was cruel. A man would judge it to savour and smell of malice, fraud and deceit.
That's a killer line. I recognise this character. This is the evil Richard that we know and love.
Exactly, and that's something that Shakespeare clearly expands.
He's really not afraid to use history, to use the past, to make moral points, is he? Good, bad. Do it like this, don't do it like that.
That's exactly right. History is told and retold because it tells you lessons, because you start to think about things that you might be able to do rather better than last time.
A cautionary tale.
For Elizabethan audiences, tales of the country torn apart by rival factions struck a powerful chord. Just 60 years earlier, Henry VIII's break with Rome had caused the country to divide along religious fault lines, Protestant and Catholic. So another civil war seemed an ever-present danger.
Is this all happening because Elizabeth I is getting old? They're worried she's going to die. They're worried there's going to be another War with the Roses.
That's exactly right. There's a great fear that there will be a religious war that will be even worse than the dynastic war of the Wars of the Roses.
So this is water cooler conversation in the 1590s?
I would have thought so, yes.
Shakespeare redefined the Wars of the Roses, and he turned Richard III from a crude Tudor cliché into a truly captivating anti-hero. From David Garrick in the 18th century to Edmund Kean in the 19th, the biggest stars of the stage have made their names playing the part.
Right from the start, audiences were fascinated by Shakespeare's character of Richard III. There's a story about the most famous Elizabethan actor, Richard Burbage. He was playing the part, and that night he got a message from a lady who'd been in the audience saying, "Come to my room, Mr. Burbage. I've taken a fancy to you." But she wanted him to come in character. She'd been seduced by Richard III's blend of cruelty and charisma, which has kept people interested ever since.
Shakespeare followed the lead of Tudor historians by playing up Richard's apparently monstrous appearance. And the Royal Shakespeare Company's costume collection reveals how Richard's physical body has come to define our image of the man.
Robin, how many different depictions of Richard III have you had here in Stratford?
Well, since 1886, which was the first permanent theatre company in Stratford, there's been around 45 different productions.
Wow.
He's definitely one of the most popular, I think, yes. The first one I can show you is actually my favourite, and that's a 1984 production of Richard III, and it was actually played by Sir Anthony Shearer. He played it as a spider. In the text, he's described as a bottled spider. He was wearing a very tight lycra bodysuit.
It's a bit like those pyjamas that kids wear with Superman, you know, and they have built-in muscles.
That's exactly it. Yeah, exactly. This is one of 3 humps that were used in the production, and it's the one that he wore most of the time on stage. So it's, I guess you could say, his favourite hump.
It smells bad.
It does, yes.
It's a very unattractive item altogether, isn't it?
It was actually strapped on to Anthony Shearer.
Little buttons up the front.
So he would have worn this very tight and close to his body.
It's basically because of Shakespeare that I'm thinking that the smell of Anthony Shearer's sweat is the smell of evil. So can we have a look at a contrasting Richard III?
This is from a 1980 production of Richard III. Alan Howard, who played Richard III. Again, this is a different concentration on another disability. Critics actually compared it to a surgical boot. Unlike Anthony Shear, who is very nimble across the stage, Alan Howard, his interpretation was very, very slow, very heavy. You could see how much pain he was in throughout the production.
What's going on with this arm here?
Ah, yes, that's Richard's withered arm.
Oh, it really is withering away. It looks like a zombie falling to pieces as he walks along.
Yes.
Is he always portrayed with a physical problem of some kind?
Yes, I think they do all have some type of disability. Today, I think we kind of take that with us. So Shakespeare's idea of Richard III is kind of our idea of Richard III, really.
For Shakespeare and his first audiences, Richard's hunch and his arm and his limp weren't just physical deformities. They believed in the science of physiognomy that suggested that your outward appearance reflected your inner self. So if Richard was deformed, he must have had an irredeemably evil soul.
The tale of the Princes in the Tower reveals the enduring power of Shakespeare's depiction of the monstrous Richard. In 1483, Richard imprisoned his 2 young nephews in the Tower of London after the death of their father, King Edward IV. And there he had the tender babes murdered, this ruthless piece of butchery, giving him the crown that was rightfully theirs. In the 17th century, people were still gripped by tales of evil Richard. So well over 100 years after the disappearance of the unfortunate princes, their fate remained a fascinating mystery to be solved. And in 1619, the historian Sir George Buck heard that the bodies of the princes might still be in the tower.
Buck wrote that certain bones, like the bones of a child, had been found in a remote and desolate turret of the tower. But on closer examination, these turned out to be the bones of an ape. It's quite a sad story. One of the apes from the Tower Menagerie wandered off. It somehow got itself into this turret, and there it died.
A few decades later, one John Webb reported a more promising lead.
A secret, sealed room had been discovered, built into one of the walls of the King's lodgings. That's a building that was here. It's gone now. And in the secret room, there was a table, and on the table, there were bones. This time, at least the bones were human, not animals. But the problem was that these were the remains of really little children, 6 or 8 years old, too young to have been the little princes.
At last, in 1674, the 190-year-old mystery appeared to have been solved.
Workmen excavating the foundations of a predecessor at this staircase discovered a wooden chest, and in it were more children, 2 of them. This time, it was decided that they really and truly were the little princes.
The discovery of these remains only fueled an obsession with this legendary crime. And when the princes were at last laid to rest, the reigning monarch, Charles II, seized the opportunity to condemn wicked King Richard's terrible wrong.
These bones from the tower were brought to a final resting place at Westminster Abbey, burial place of kings and queens since Edward the Confessor. Charles II commissioned a special marble funeral urn for the little princes, and this proved to be the perfect place to hold their murderer to account. The inscription on it said that they'd been killed by their perfidious uncle, Richard the Usurper. So the Stuarts took the Tudor tale about Richard's crimes. They accepted it as fact, and they even set it in stone.
When Queen Victoria came to the throne more than 3.5 centuries after the start of the Wars of the Roses, the conflict was little more than a distant memory. And the Victorian vision of medieval England was shaped by the best-selling novelist Sir Walter Scott, His rip-roaring tales of knights in shining armour were full of historical fantasy, but very short on historical fact.
To 19th century romantics like Walter Scott, the Wars of the Roses represented the Middle Ages gone wrong. Scott wasn't very fond of the period. Out of more than 20 novels, he only set one in it, the rather obscure Anne of Geierstein. And he doesn't make it sound very nice. England is torn and bleeding. There are piles of slain bodies and quite a lot of drenching in blood. To Walter Scott, the Wars of the Roses had too much brutality and not enough chivalry to be a bestseller. But what Walter Scott did do for the Wars of the Roses was give it its name. Listen to this. He talks about the civil discords so dreadfully prosecuted in the Wars of the White and Red Roses. This is more than 300 years after the ending of the conflict, but this is the first time that anybody's called it that.
Most Victorians didn't question the well-established mythology of the Wars of the Roses, and they enjoyed a spot of Shakespeare as much as their predecessors. But 19th century historians took a very dim view of the period.
So, Helen, we're sitting in the middle of a Victorian vision of the Middle Ages, which they loved. But they didn't much like the 15th century, did they?
They didn't. They were very interested in the Middle Ages as a whole, but they saw the 15th century as something dark, corrupted, an unhappy time.
Who were these Victorian historians writing about the Wars of the Roses?
The key figure is William Stubbs, Bishop William Stubbs. He was a hugely influential figure in the development of the discipline. It was while he was Regius Professor at Oxford that the first students began to be able to take history as a degree subject there. But he was also a clergyman. He ended his life as Bishop of Oxford.
He could really turn a phrase, couldn't he, Mr. Stubbs?
Yes, certainly. The 15th century, in Stubbs's view, goes something like this. The sun of the Plantagenets went down in clouds and thick darkness. The coming of the Tudors gave as yet no promise of light. It was as the morning spread upon the mountains, darkest before the dawn.
It sounds like Victorian historians were quite happy to pass judgment on the past, black and white, good and bad.
They're not only not afraid to judge the past, they saw it as part of their job. For historians like Stubbs, their Christianity was an intrinsic part of what it meant to be a historian. So they needed to look in the archives, they needed to find out the information. They were great scholars, but then they needed to stand back to assess what they'd found and stand in judgment on it. And their judgment had to take in the moral dimensions of their worldview. They were quite willing to say that certain actions, certain people, and certain periods were evil.
I'm thinking that he's typical of a type of historian that we call Whig historians. That's a broad grouping, but what is this thing called Whig history?
Really, when we talk about Whig history, we're talking about a view of history as progress, as a movement towards the best of all possible worlds, which is embodied in 19th century society, 19th century politics.
So Victorians see an onward march of progress up to the Wars of the Roses, then it slips back, and then it's up and up and up again to the glorious perfection of Queen Victoria.
Progress isn't always quite that straightforward. Obviously, there are lumps and bumps along the way, but the 15th century seemed a pretty dark age when the country collapsed into civil war, and it seemed as though the forces of law and the enlightenment of constitutional progress were being overwhelmed by overmighty subjects and aristocratic faction.
Although Bishop Stubbs and his colleagues weren't writing for the mass market, their judgment on the Wars of the Roses as a great leap backwards, as an interruption to the march of progress, has proved extremely influential.
Now this is perhaps my favourite history book. It's called 1066 and all that, A Memorable History of England. It's basically a spoof of those very self-confident Victorian historians like Bishop Stubbs and his chums. And like them, it's not afraid to make judgments about history. Here's the 17th century English Civil War, for example, between the Cavaliers and the Roundheads. The Cavaliers being wrong, but romantic, and the Roundheads right, but repulsive. What have they got to say about the Wars of the Roses? Well, it was all because the barons, who made a stupendous effort using sackage, carnage and wreckage so to stave off the Tudors for a time. They achieved this by a very clever plan known as the Wars of the Roses. So just like the Victorian historians, this book thinks that it was the fault of the bad barons. Clearly the whole thing's a joke, but minus the jokes and plus a few more dates, this was pretty much how generations of school kids were taught their history.
But no account of the Wars of the Roses could ever hope to rival the remarkable staying power of Shakespeare's drama. In the 20th century, his Richard III made the leap from stage to screen.
March on! Join bravely! Let us do it, Hamlet!
In 1955, Laurence Olivier both directed and starred in Richard III. He turned Shakespeare's story into a technicolor spectacular, and he turned Richard III himself into the ultimate Hollywood villain, complete with pathetic villainous nose.
Now is the winter of our discontent, made glorious summer by this son of York.
Olivier delivers his scheming monologues straight down the camera, eyeball to eyeball. He draws us into his murderous plots.
I can smile and murder whilst I smile.
He's both monstrous and magnetic.
And wet my cheeks with artificial tears and frame my face to all occasion.
This was the definitive Richard III for the 20th century. Everybody else who played the part would be measured against Olivier. In America, the film was shown on television the same day that it opened in cinemas. As many as 40 million people watched it. That's more than the total number of people who'd seen it in theatres over the whole 350 years since it was first performed. "40 years after Olivier, Ian McKellen played Richard III as the greatest tyrant of them all, Adolf Hitler. Complete with murderous moustache.
Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by this son of York.
This version of Richard III didn't make any connection to the real events of the 15th century. Shakespeare's plot was so well known that it had become a sort of timeless parable. Richard III had become the biggest baddie in history, and the Wars of the Roses symbolised a nation's darkest hour. But a new and radically different tale of good King Richard was also emerging, which turned Shakespeare's familiar story on its head. In 1924, the Richard III Society was founded to counter what they saw as outrageous Tudor lies and to paint a much more flattering portrait of Richard. Their Richard was a good lord and a mighty prince, and he definitely didn't have a hunchback. Centuries after Richard's death, his supporters, the Ricardians, were determined to clear his name. The culmination of Richard's rehabilitation came in 2012 with the extraordinary discovery of his body here in this car park in Leicester. After centuries of conjecture and half-truths and even downright lies, here was some hard evidence for the real Richard. Just 5 feet under the tarmac,
archaeologists made the remarkable find. The Ricardians were delighted finally to lay eyes on their hero. But even from a quick glance, it was clear that this man did have an abnormal curvature of the spine. In a battle where opinions mattered more than facts, Richard's physical imperfections didn't shake the Ricardians' conviction. In the Wars of the Roses, the wrong man had come out on top. For them, the final twist in the tale is that Henry VII, not Richard, was the true villain of the piece. To the Ricardians, the triumphant Tudor was nothing more than a ruthless usurper who had slandered Richard's good name. As Henry VII faced their wrath, his defenders rallied round. In 2013, another royal fan club was born, the Henry Tudor Society.
So Nathan, what is this?
It's a small representation of a statue that we're hoping to put up in Pembroke. I feel that Henry Tudor is an overlooked monarch.
Since Richard III was dug up, there's been a bit of sort of rehabilitation of his reputation. Do you think this means that inevitably Henry Tudor's gone down?
Unfortunately, yes, it does seem that way. For one king to become unmaligned, it seems that some feel that another has to become maligned.
So how many members have you got?
Currently, there's 12,000 people on my Facebook page.
Wow. And how many has Richard III got then? Shall we? Let's compare. Did you say you've got 12,000?
I have 12,358.
Oh, I hate to tell you this, Nathan, but Richard III has got 16,000. He is ahead of you, but not by much.
Not by much. We're hot on your tails, Richard.
And is there sort of tension between the two societies? How do you get on together? Not well, I imagine.
If you believe some things you read on Facebook, this man was a monster, a usurper, a ruthless, evil king. But in my opinion, this was a king who was without doubt the cleverest man to ever sit on the throne of England, and he was recognised throughout Europe as a generous family man.
The need to find a hero and a villain of the Wars of the Roses remains as strong as ever. In 2015, 530 years after his death on the battlefield at Bosworth, Richard III was finally laid to rest in Leicester Cathedral, in a tomb fit for a king.
Ironically, the discovery of Richard's curved spine shows that what had seemed to be the most outrageous piece of myth-making of all, the hunchbacked king, was close to reality. But fascinating though Richard's bones are, they can't really tell us what sort of a man or what sort of a king he was.
Because history is more than a series of dates, facts, and bones. It's a collection of stories. And all stories reveal just as much about their authors as they do about the heroes and the villains they portray.
While Richard has been laid to rest, the story of the Wars of the Roses certainly hasn't.
Next time, I'll be exploring the Glorious Revolution. Was it really glorious? And was it really a revolution? Lots of people remember their history lessons from school as dates and battles, kings and queens, facts and figures. But the story of our past is open to interpretation. And much of British history is a carefully edited and even deceitful version of events.
You might think that history is just a record of what happened. Actually, it's not like that at all. As soon as you do a little digging, you discover that it's more like a tapestry of different stories woven together by whoever was in power at the time.
In this series, I'm going to debunk some of the biggest fibs in British history. In the 15th century, the story of the Wars of the Roses was invented by the Tudors to justify their power, and then immortalised by the greatest storyteller of them all, William Shakespeare.
Now is the winter of our discontent.
In the 19th century, a British government coup in India was rebranded by the Victorians as the civilising triumph of the empire. And in this programme, I'll discover how in the 17th century, British MPs joined forces with a Dutch prince to spin a foreign invasion into a story of liberation.
If you think that William the Conqueror was the last person to invade these shores, think again. Just 300 years ago, another William, William of Orange, led an equally successful attack.
William has gone down in history to some as the heroic King Billy. To others, he's a bloody usurper. But his attack isn't remembered as a foreign invasion. It's often described instead as a peaceful transfer of power, a necessary measure that saved England from the tyrannical King James II.
This was our glorious revolution.
Or so the story goes.
With history, the line between fact and fiction often gets blurred.
In the 17th century, the English civil wars between royalists and republicans tore the country apart, and Charles I was beheaded. Never again would the monarchy be allowed to wield absolute power. So in 1685, when James II became king and started throwing his weight around, his enemies decided that something must be done. What followed became known as the Glorious Revolution. James II is the villain of this carefully constructed tale. He abdicates, giving way to the noble Dutch Protestant William III of Orange and his English wife Mary. In this swift and glorious transfer of power, the golden couple put an end to the absolute power of the monarchy. They banish Catholicism and restore order and liberty to our nation. And all without a drop of English blood being spilt.
For many people, James II was a good old-fashioned tyrant, harking back to the bad old days of Charles I.
But the biggest problem with James was the fact that he was a Catholic king in a country that was largely Protestant.
In England, at least, a Catholic monarch was associated with absolutism. He believed in the divine right to rule and to ride roughshod over his subjects.
James didn't do much to play down this tyrannical image. When a rebellion rose up against him, he executed 250 of the participants. And when 7 Anglican bishops dared to challenge his pro-Catholic policies, he threw them into the Tower of London. James's enemies wanted a Protestant monarch who respected the powers of Parliament.
So James was a Catholic. He appointed his fellow Catholics to high office. That caused annoyance. And worst of all, he married a Catholic, Mary of Modena. This meant that any children, any heirs that they might have, would be Catholics too. But for James's Protestant enemies, there was a glimmer of hope.
James hadn't produced a Catholic heir. He only had his 2 daughters, both Protestant, from his first marriage. And his new wife, Mary, had lost 8 children as a result of miscarriages, stillbirths, and deaths in infancy.
If James's wife, Mary, proved unable to give him a baby boy, and time was ticking on, she wasn't getting any younger, then James's line would stutter to a stop. This Catholic part of the royal family would simply die out.
Then on the 23rd of December 1687, it was announced that Mary of Modena was pregnant again. As each month passed, it looked ever more likely that she might give birth to a healthy baby.
The Protestants thought that something had to be done. Were they going to rise up against James and have a civil war? No. Instead, they waged a war of words. The bedchamber became a battlefield.
With the horrors of the English Civil Wars still within living memory, regicide was out of the question. Any regime change would need to be legally justified. So James's enemies began to spin a yarn.
As Mary's pregnancy progressed, people put it about that it was a fake or perhaps a fantasy. Even James's grown-up daughters, the Protestant princesses, Mary and Anne, got in on the act here. They spread gossip that nobody had felt the baby quickening, and here's the clincher, nobody had seen any milk.
But on the 10th of June 1688, Mary of Modena defied the doubters and gave birth to a healthy baby boy.
Now, you might think that the birth would have put an end to the debate, but in fact, it intensified it, because some people said that the real baby had died and that an imposter had been smuggled into the Queen's bed in a warming pan.
The tittle-tattle in London's coffee houses started to sway public opinion against the king. And James's response only made the situation worse. He summoned 42 witnesses to make sworn statements that they'd seen Mary give birth. James published these depositions. It was an attempt to silence his Protestant enemies.
John, tell me a bit more about this warming pan incident. How did it actually work?
Comes from quite an innocuous detail in these depositions. So there's a gentlewoman of the bedchamber called Margaret Dawson who says, I saw fire carried in to warm the Queen's bed in a warming pan. But then in this pamphlet, a full answer to the depositions, which basically goes through the depositions and tears them to pieces and says, this isn't good enough, this isn't enough detail, it's not enough evidence. It picks up on this detail of the warming pan. And it says inside that warming pan was an illegitimate child who had been born in the convent next door. The pamphlet gives us the route that the child took. It's carried through these passages, so this is the passage below, up some stairs, through a closet above, through some more passages above, through here, through a gallery, then through some lodgings, and then into the Queen's great bedchamber, into the bed where she's in labour. And through the curtain, and the dot goes all the way
into
right
the
up
bed
into
itself.
the bed, and then they pop the child into the bed.
It must have happened. The map says that it did.
Indeed.
What other sort of stuff was produced that helped to tell this story of the warming pan?
What we have here is a pair of images, the first of which is celebrating the prince's birth. So you have Mary of Modena here, with her hand in the Prince of Wales's crib. The Prince of Wales here is looking very splendid. He has some flowers in his hair, and it's a kind of...
Hurrah, we've got a lovely little baby boy.
Exactly. Isn't that lovely?
And then what happens in this one? It's
in
been
this one,
subverted a bit.
It is. This figure that's added in here is Father Edward Petre, who's an English Jesuit who had rose to be an advisor of James II. This led to rumours that he was, in fact, the father of the Prince of Wales.
Which is why he's creeping up behind her and giving her a squeeze.
That's exactly right.
Do you think it's possible that James II wouldn't have got into so much trouble if he'd been able to tell a better story?
One of the problems is that the warming pan fiction is, even though it's not plausible, that people are willing to go along with it because they would rather believe that the child was illegitimate than face the prospects of an England that is Catholic for years and years and years.
The warming pan affair may sound far-fetched, but it was a juicy tabloid tale, powerful enough to stir up treason. James's right to rule was increasingly being questioned, and James's enemies had now won the public support they needed to remove the anointed king. There was once a grand Tudor mansion here in the village of Hurley on the banks of the River Thames. It was called Lady Place. Its owner was the 3rd Baron Lovelace, a member of Parliament and one of James II's enemies.
Lovelace was a bit of a rogue. He was a drinker and a gambler and, above all, a Catholic hater. once he got a court summons for some public order offence, but the magistrate issuing it was a Catholic. So Lovelace took his court summons, he screwed it up, and he used it to wipe his bottom in public.
Nothing of Lady Place stands above ground today. But hidden away, here in someone's back garden, a little bit of it still remains.
These are the cellars of Lady Place, and they're connected by a secret tunnel to the banks of the River Thames just over there, so you could arrive and leave unseen. Lovelace hosted clandestine meetings here for like-minded noblemen who were all plotting against King James II.
In these secret meetings, a plot was hatched to overthrow the king. But these men weren't going to take up arms themselves. Instead, they wrote a letter inviting someone else to do their dirty work.
This is a copy of the letter they wrote, dated the 30th of June, 1688. It's been signed by 7 people, but they haven't given their names. They've given secret code numbers instead. Somebody has written in later who they really were. Shrewsbury, Devonshire, Danby, Lumley, the Bishop of London, Russell, Sidney. These were all top politicians. You can see why they didn't want to sign it with their names, because their letter is just full of treason. Listen to this. The people are so generally dissatisfied with the present conduct of the government in relation to their religion, liberty, and properties. And here they get right down to business. 19 parts of 20 of the people throughout the kingdom are desirous of a change.
Playing on anti-Catholic sentiments, this letter tells the tale of a country in peril. A country that needed to be saved. It was addressed to a Protestant prince from the Netherlands, William of Orange.
It even talks about William landing in England, and it says that the people will venture forth to meet him when he does this. The message is pretty clear. It is, William, Prince of Orange, please invade us.
In the unfolding drama of the Glorious Revolution, this wouldn't be described as treason. It was the letter of invitation, a plea from a beleaguered nation in a time of need. If William accepted, he would be presented as the answer to England's prayers. This is William's palace, Het Loo in the Netherlands, from where he reigned as stadtholder, which is almost like a constitutional king. And it's pretty clear why William was the conspirators' ideal candidate to take the English throne.
William was James II's nephew. But more importantly, his wife really was a Stuart. She was James's own daughter, Mary.
In England, Ireland and Scotland, these royal Stuart credentials might help make the coup look more like a legitimate succession.
If William, and indeed Mary, could be placed on the English throne, then this needn't be seen as a coup at all, just as an orderly transition from father to daughter. And these two had excellent credentials as monarchs in waiting because they were both Protestant.
James's enemies had chosen well. But William of Orange had even more to gain from going along with their plan.
William was playing an even longer game than simply becoming King of Britain, and this is why the invitation was so attractive to him. If he were to invade and get the crown, then he'd be toppling a Catholic king. Good thing. More importantly, though, he'd be getting more power to move against an even more dangerous Catholic threat nearer home, Louis XIV, the Sun King of France.
Louis XIV was the most absolute of absolute monarchs. and his armies were a constant threat to the Dutch Republic. William was determined to protect Protestant Northern Europe against Louis. The rivalry between the two men was played out in a game of garden design. Here, William ordered fountains, even bigger and better than those at Louis's own opulent palace, Versailles. But for evidence of William's more enlightened style of monarchy, you have to go into his bedroom. In the 17th century, the state bedroom wasn't a private place. This is where the sovereign received important guests.
What would you say is the most significant difference between Louis XIV's bedroom at Versailles and William's bedroom here?
I think it's the absence of a balustrade, just where we stand here, to divide the room into two parts. And in France, people had to make a bow in front of the balustrade, even if the king was absent. But William III is more, you know, more open to the public, more open-minded perhaps, and more open to the parliament. Maybe that's the difference.
So we've got Louis, the absolute monarch, with his get-out, stay-away balustrade. Yeah. But William, not as a Democrat, but as a more friendly Republican, he says, come on in.
I believe so.
A friendly king.
Exactly.
But William wasn't going to beat Louis with one-upmanship in the bedroom. He needed Protestant allies to crush Louis in battle. Getting his hands on the British Navy would give William the edge he needed. And now he had an open invitation to walk right in and take it.
So this is William's private closet, yes? A room for secrets.
Exactly. It's the most intimate space you can imagine. It's very small, but very elaborate. And it's his office, more or less. Yes, it's his office. He works here at this very spot.
Am I right to imagine William III sitting here, reading his letter of invitation and drawing up his plan for the invasion of Britain?
Oh, it's so tempting. Yes, I want to believe it was at that low that he made plans for his invasion. It all took place here.
So this is a really significant room in the whole of British history.
It is.
Britain's parliamentary conspirators had their champion lined up. But who was really controlling the narrative here?
Now, we think that William was invited to invade England, but what's the real story? It's more complicated than that, isn't it?
It is definitely more complicated, because he had already taken a decision to go to England probably in November 1687, and if he got the invitation by the English, then, let's say, he was safe. He wanted to legitimize his trip by asking people in England to invite him so that he could give the expedition a legal cover.
In April 1688, 2 months before the invitation, one of the 7 conspirators had come here to The Hague for a secret meeting with William. Gilbert Burnet, William's chaplain and historian, kept a record of the meeting.
Burnet wrote that William said it would be great if some people in England would invite him and that he would be ready in a few months' time.
By the end of September to come over. That's to invade England.
That's to invade England, yeah. William was a lifetime enemy of Louis XIV, so there was a great chance that there would be a new war. And in that war, England had to help William III.
So he has to put together a document that's going to sell his case to the English, to the British people, really. And this, fantastically, is handwritten. This must be the original. The Declaration of His Highness William, Prince of Orange, the reasons inducing him to appear in arms in the Kingdom of England for the preserving of the Protestant religion and for restoring the laws and the liberties of Great Britain and Ireland. So nothing in there about France. It's all about you guys, English people. Yes. Be happy.
Yes. William says that he wants to call a free and legal parliament that would abolish all the rules or all the laws and all the violations of the laws that James II had perpetrated.
So he had it written by a Dutch civil servant. It was translated into English by Burnet, and it looks to me like Burnet has improved it. You can see him adding in extra little words and rewriting it here, and he's added in a bit about the Houses of Parliament. He's added in remarkable. Presumably that was all helping to sell the case, to make it smoother, to make it more acceptable to the British.
Because, of course, the English people weren't going to know anything about the real plans of William III with England, namely that England would have to join him against France.
I'm more and more impressed with William's foresight. It seems that he's several moves ahead of everybody else in a European game of chess. And it's very clever the way he's written himself into the story, with the pre-invitation, then the invitation, then the declaration. You can see all of these things as individual pieces of politics, as spin, if you like, until they stick, and then they become history.
With his declaration to the British prepared, William and his parliamentary plotters put his invasion plan into action. His flag proudly proclaimed his message for religion and liberty. But just as they set sail, a storm blowing from the west stalled William's progress and kept him in port. And because it helped James, people called it the Catholic wind.
But then...
And it suddenly turned round.
William's luck changed.
His luck certainly changed. And it blew just as hard from completely the opposite direction. So that was the Protestant wind.
That shot him all the way down the channel.
So now they had the initiative and shot down the channel at record speed with a very strong easterly wind behind them.
Can you describe this fleet that came sailing down the English Channel?
Well, lots of people saw it, that's the first thing. It was so huge that when they came down the channel, they decided to make a parade of it and went through 25 abreast, stretching almost from Dover all the way to Calais, with brigade bands playing cheerful tunes. The idea was to offend King James and Louis XIV at the same time, which they did very effectively because lots of people saw this and were utterly astonished, of course, because nothing like it had been seen before, or again.
So it's a cross between a fleet and a pantomime.
William III understood the importance of making a big impact on the public.
Theatre, if you like.
The theatre of politics. He understood that very well, yes.
Now, we've been talking about this as an invasion. Is that the right word to use, in your opinion?
It was an invasion, but it was very important to present it as if it were not an invasion. One of the things the Dutch troops were given very strict orders about was that they must never call it an invasion, whatever they do. They would be severely punished. They were told they must not tell the English that they had invaded and conquered the country.
The parliamentary conspiracy was going to plan.
Hello!
William's huge army disembarked unopposed here at Brixham. The locals in this Devon fishing village just stood by and watched.
One Dutch observer reported that all along the roadside, the men, the women and the children were waving out, "God bless, 100 good wishes to you." Well, he was Dutch, he would say that, wouldn't he? William really had left nothing to chance. Amongst all these supplies coming off the ships at Brixham, the spare boots, the pickled herrings, the horses, there was one more vital weapon of war. It was a printing press.
Before setting sail, William printed his version of events, 60,000 copies of the Declaration, an early example of printed propaganda. And as soon as he landed, he started printing even more.
William was carpet-bombing England with his manifesto. His declaration was everywhere, listing his reasons inducing him to appear in arms in the Kingdom of England. He's not keeping a low profile, is he?
As he marched on Exeter, the Dutch prince's army met with no resistance. He entered the city in spectacular fashion, not as an invader, but as the nation's saviour. 200 soldiers in armour led the way on Flemish horses, accompanied by a further 200 Africans from the Dutch colonies in white turbans. William himself was dressed in gleaming armour, a white plume blowing in the wind. He was riding a white horse. His banner bore the words, "God and the Protestant religion." If you knew your Bible, the symbolism was pretty obvious. A white horse heralded the arrival of a divine conqueror, or even Christ himself. In the book of Revelation, heaven opened, and behold, a white horse. He who sat on him was called Faithful and True. In righteousness he judges and makes war. In his eyes are flames of fire, and on his head are many crowns. William had come to seize the crown, but by presenting himself in his theatrical get-up, he didn't look like an invader. He looked like a Christian saviour. William's theatrical progress didn't stop there. In Exeter Cathedral, he ordered his chaplain to preach from the text of his declaration, with its theme of a free parliament. The securing to the whole nation the free enjoyment of all their laws, rights and liberties under a just and legal government. He also gave religious assurances. The preservation of the Protestant religion, the covering of all men from persecution of their consciences. The chaplain then led the congregation in the Te Deum, a hymn in which the people asked God to save them, to lift them up, and most importantly, to govern them. And then, with quite dazzling hubris, he seated himself here, in the spectacular throne of the medieval bishops of Exeter. He wasn't king yet, but with his propaganda and his pageantry and his sense of purpose, he was halfway there. The Dutch prince was cleverly transforming himself into a very British hero. A Protestant knight in shining armour, leading a glorious revolution. Not an invader, not a usurper, but a liberator. James was in trouble. And as he prepared for battle to put an end to William's story of triumph, disaster struck. James had a nosebleed and retreated from the battlefield. The conspirators said that the nosebleed was a sign of weakness. And when James fled England, they announced that the king had abdicated. The fleeing James had gone into exile in Louis XIV's Catholic France. To his enemies, this confirmed where his true loyalties had been all along. There was now a constitutional power vacuum. For William to fill James's royal shoes, he and the parliamentary conspirators would have to keep promoting their agenda. William's glorious progress had to be turned into a plausible new chapter in British history. Mary's Stuart lineage now came into play. She and William were offered a joint monarchy. They'd rule together. This had never happened before, and it hasn't happened since. But this special arrangement allowed a story that was really about conspiracy and intrigue to be transformed into the tale of an orderly succession. On the day William and Mary formally accepted the joint crown, they had a declaration read aloud to them. It defined the limits of their power, as well as the duties and responsibilities they owed to Parliament. That declaration was enshrined in law as the Bill of Rights. It set down Protestant superiority in law and banned Catholics from ever taking the throne. It enshrined certain civil liberties, and it ordered that no law should be imposed without parliamentary approval. Most of all, it formalised a narrative that backed up William and Mary's claim to the throne. The Bill of Rights gave the conspirators the constrained monarchy they wanted.
It strikes me that this bill was a very finely judged piece of sort of political magic. Is that correct?
I think that the main thing that it was intended to try to sort of persuade people of was that this was not an invasion, but it was rather a legitimate coronation. So in the first part of the document, it's an attempt on the part of the political nation to wriggle out of a slightly sticky situation. That's to say, they've got to characterize James as a tyrant and as therefore illegitimate, which makes the revolution legitimate.
Having written James and any future Catholic threat out of the picture, the Bill of Rights now declared William and Mary's legitimate right to rule.
So that's part one, and then part two is the future, is it?
That's right, yes. So part two is the Declaration of Rights proper. It is, if you like, that bit that might be seen as an expression of enlightened ideas, an assertion of the liberty of the people and of the sovereignty of Parliament. So, for example, they say there that the king may not raise taxation without the consent of Parliament, that there has to be free elections, that there has to be freedom of speech in Parliament.
The transition from a monarchy with absolute power to a monarchy in service to Parliament was almost complete. The Bill of Rights began what we now call our constitutional monarchy. It's the foundation stone of parliamentary democracy.
The Bill of Rights was a winner's charter. It was written by and for the supporters of the new regime. It legitimised the joint monarchy of William and Mary, but it also gave more power to Parliament. Much more power. So much that you could call it a revolution. And if you happen to be a Protestant parliamentarian, then you might even think that it was all rather glorious.
The events of 1688 now had a suitably grand title. The conspirators were determined to find the perfect words for this glorious and historic episode. Best of all, the coup had gone like clockwork, so they could describe it as a peaceful transition, a bloodless revolution. But as William's glorious revolution was rolled out across Scotland and Ireland, it was anything but. James's supporters were known as the Jacobites, and in Ireland and Scotland they continued the struggle against William. In March 1689, James joined his allies in County Cork with troops supplied by Louis XIV. William landed in the north of Ireland the following year and marched on Dublin. On the 1st of July 1690, their armies met here, on the banks of the River Boyne.
And now, for the first time in the whole of their long power struggle, James II and his son-in-law William faced each other in the field at the Battle of the Boyne.
James's army was over 25,000 strong. William had a force of 40,000 men. This would be a bloody battle. William attempted to cross the river from the west. James diverted most of his troops to head him off. But this left the rest of James's army exposed. William was merciless. James's soldiers held out for 3 hours before being overwhelmed.
One French witness said, "This is the 6th battle that I've seen, but I've never seen such a rout." William's troops were ruthlessly efficient. They picked off the fleeing Jacobites like hares amongst the corn, he said.
James was defeated. He fled again to France and would never return. But the fighting continued, and William sanctioned even bloodier slaughter elsewhere. A year after the Boyne, William's men met Jacobite forces at Aughrim in County Galway on the 12th of July 1691. It was carnage. The Jacobites suffered losses of 7,000, William's side only 700.
In the aftermath of the battle, one observer reported seeing Irish soldiers with mutilated limbs, asking for the sword as a remedy. Meanwhile, others, he said, spewed forth their breath mixed with blood and threats. There was so much blood that it flowed over the ground, and you could hardly take a step without slipping in it.
This battle marks the end of Jacobite resistance in Ireland. William would be later reinvented as a Protestant hero, King Billy. For jubilant Protestants, Aughrim went down in history as the single most celebrated battle. So why has the Battle of the Boyne lived longest in the national memory of Ireland?
It happened because of a funny kind of a mix-up. People had always celebrated or commemorated the Battle of Aughrim on its anniversary, the 12th of July, until 1752, when the calendar changed to bring Britain into line with Europe. Roughly 10 days got lost to British history. But people had got used to the idea of celebrating on the 12th of July. It's just that under the new system, the battle whose anniversary was closest to that date wasn't Aughrim, it was the Battle of the Boyne. And that's why the Boyne has ended up on the fridge magnet.
The Battle of the Boyne still has an almost sacred significance for Irish Protestants. King Billy had secured the future of their religion. For them, his status as a national hero and saviour remains intact to this day. Jacobite uprisings against the Glorious Revolution in Scotland were also brutally crushed. In 1692, William's men in Scotland ordered the notorious Glencoe massacre. It was punishment for the Clan MacDonald's delay in signing an oath of allegiance to William and Mary. 38 were murdered, and another 40 women and children died of exposure after their homes were torched. But despite brutality and bloodshed in Scotland and Ireland, the narrative of the Glorious Revolution held fast in England.
For William and the English Parliament, of course this was a glorious revolution. Because despite the rebellions and the bloodshed, they'd won. And if you win a conflict, you get to pick its name.
As Britain left behind the turmoil of the 17th century, the Glorious Revolution took its place in the history books. For Parliament and the Crown, the ends had justified the means. An absolutist king had been replaced with a constitutional monarchy, and it was now time to celebrate the architects of this sensible revolution.
In the 18th century, those 7 people who'd written the letter inviting William of Orange to come over started to be glorified as heroes. In 1773, the historian John Dalrymple came up with a name for them. I love this name. It makes them sound like an action film. They were called the Immortal Seven.
and the Cellars of Lady Place, where the plotters had met, became a site of pilgrimage. The conspirator Lovelace had brought William himself down here after his coronation to see the hallowed place where it all began. And successive kings would visit it as it became a shrine to the Glorious Revolution.
And this inscription that marks the fact that the revolution of 1688 was begun here.
This was a bit of brazen myth-making, but it chimes perfectly with the national mood. The peace and prosperity that followed the establishment of our constitutional monarchy was presented as the direct consequence of the Glorious Revolution. And in the late 18th century, that point of view was given an extra boost by events across the Channel. France's proud, absolute monarch Louis XVI was removed from power and executed by revolutionaries. The violence and terror of the French Revolution sent shockwaves around Europe. In Britain, it was held up as further proof of the virtues of the orderly transfer of power in 1688. The Glorious Revolution was now celebrated as a symbol of enlightened British values and superiority.
As the rest of post-revolutionary Europe descended into chaos and war, Britain marched self-confidently into the 19th century to the tune of parliamentary democracy and industrial progress and imperial expansion. For 19th century historians, it was the Glorious Revolution that was the foundation of all this success.
The greatest champion of this view was the historian and Whig politician Thomas Babington Macaulay. Macaulay's magnum opus was called The History of England. This is a book that transforms the conspirators' carefully concocted tale into history. Macaulay presents the Glorious Revolution as the masterstroke of our national story.
He writes, "It is because we had a preserving revolution in the 17th century that we have not had a destroying revolution in the 19th. For the authority of law, for the security of property, for the peace in our streets, our gratitude is due to William of Orange."
1848 became known as the year of revolution across Europe, with the notable exception of Britain. The publication of Macaulay's book in that same year was perfectly timed.
When I was a history student, we were told to read it with great caution, because this was Whig history, a bad thing. It was a powerful person's view of the past. Even at the time in the 19th century, people recognised that Macaulay was writing from a very particular standpoint. When Karl Marx came to write Das Kapital, he called him that great falsifier of history.
As a communist, Marx's view of history is never considered to be unbiased. But Macaulay's position was equally influenced by his own political views. He was a Whig politician, a member of a party that saw Victorian Britain as a shining model of democratic progress in action. For the Whigs, this was only possible because of our Glorious Revolution. When the Houses of Parliament were rebuilt after a fire in the 19th century, Macaulay and the Whigs saw this palace of democracy as a shrine to the Glorious Revolution. They commissioned a series of frescoes to remind MPs of the story of the tyrant King James and the nation's saviour William. Alice Lisle was a heroine of the Glorious Revolution who hid fleeing rebels in her home and was arrested for it by James's forces.
She is sentenced to death, which of course is burning at the stake for a woman because women aren't hanged. A plea goes to the king for clemency, and all he does is he allows her to be beheaded rather than burnt at the stake.
The next painting shows the release of the 7 bishops, who James had thrown into the Tower of London.
This is evidence that James was completely unpopular by the masses. The quantity of the public who just celebrated their acquittal was evidence that he was not the right man for the job.
In the final painting, James's tyranny is erased by the glory of constitutional monarchy.
This is the peak of the Glorious Revolution, isn't it? This is the point where it all goes well. The Clerk of the House of Lords, John Brown, is reading the Declaration of Rights to them. And we, the viewer, are reading with the clerk. We are the people reading to these 2 monarchs, saying, you have to do what we say in this document. You're not to do what James II did and disobey and make up your own rules. And, you know, for Macaulay, this is the beginning of that story of Parliament's power and the monarchy being slowly restricted.
You can absolutely see why this picture is right outside the House of Commons.
Makes complete sense, doesn't it?
Macaulay's Whig version of events held sway into the 20th century. The Empire and 2 world wars had consolidated a sense of patriotic pride. In 1988, just a few yards away from Macaulay's glorious frescoes, the House of Commons debated a proposal to send the Queen a message from Parliament marking the 300th anniversary of the Glorious Revolution.
The main events are well known. The defiance of the orders of King James II by the bishops and the judges, the invitation to William of Orange and Mary to defend our ancient rights and liberties, the landing at Torbay and the peaceful transfer of power, which gave rise to the title of the Bloodless Revolution in England, although it was not like that in Scotland, and it was a very different story in Ireland.
Margaret Thatcher's socialist adversary, Neil Kinnock, had a rare moment of agreement with her.
This motion to express to Her Majesty our pleasure at the tercentenary of the Revolution is a worthy act, not only because it celebrates a significant advance, as the Prime Minister just said, but also because it requires us all to consider the character of our democracy and the ways in which arduously and slowly it has been brought this far to our time.
Why do you think, Ted, that the Whig version of the Glorious Revolution persisted for such a long time?
I think it lasted for such a long time because it was not just a version of history that sort of worked for a particular political party. It was also something that really spoke to Britain's place in the world in the 19th century. And it really fitted into narratives about the growth of Britain as a world power, as the apex of civilization in the world, as, you know, the exemplar in terms of its political institutions. So everything that the revolution said about it as a founding moment in sort of the creation of this British liberty was really sort of feeding into this rise to power of the British state.
So we have these soldiers and administrators straddling the globe with their power poses, and
Yes.
they think it all began in 1688.
Yes.
But then Tony Benn's dissenting voice challenged the dominant version of events.
Then we are told that this was the birth of our democratic rights. There were the people who were represented in this House in 1688. Well, 2%, was it, of rich men, no working people, no middle-class voters, no women. It was nothing to do with democracy at all.
When do people really start to say, hang on, it wasn't that glorious for people who were poor, people who were women, people who were Irish, people who were Scots?
Yep.
When does that start coming forwards?
With the development of Marxist thought and socialist thought as well, focusing upon, no longer upon the political elite, but upon ordinary working men and women. And so we start to get that being questioned. But one other aspect there is also, you know, in terms of what people define as a revolution. And so as a kind of more class-based Marxist definition of what a revolution was came to the fore...
This doesn't count.
This doesn't count. It's not a real revolution. You know, we don't include this in our list of real revolutions. And instead, the 1640s, the Civil War, the execution of Charles I, this becomes the real revolution, and this is the thing that people should focus on, celebrate, talk about, try and educate people about.
After 300 years, 1688's status as a bloodless revolution was questioned and revised. Margaret Thatcher conceded that it may have been a little less than glorious.
Even great events are subject to constantly shifting judgments and interpretations. Not every legacy of 1688 is a happy one, above all in Ireland.
In the 20th century, the legacy of 1688 erupted into violence. Republicans versus Unionists. Catholics versus Protestants. The people of Britain and Ireland continued to create competing accounts of the past, often with tragic consequences. For Protestants celebrating the Battle of the Boyne, the hero of the drama retains his power to this day. His image is paraded in the orange marches held in his name. And even when the marchers move on, his image remains.
In some parts of Belfast, then, you can still spot images of William III. He's part of the fabric of the city, riding about on his white horse in his 17th century wig and coat. He looks a bit incongruous in this urban environment. He's a long way away from the palaces and battlefields where he really lived.
In Protestant Northern Ireland, everybody knows him by a different name, King Billy.
We're taking it here to show you one of the older style murals.
Prince of Orange.
Prince of Orange.
Ooh. I see King Billy's on his white horse.
And it is significant because the first mural or painting, wall painting of Billy was in East Belfast back in 1904, and he was painted on a white horse. His horse was never white, his horse was brown. A white horse would have made him a very easy target. The horse is white because it looks glorious, a white stallion. And you can always see it looks like it's walking on water. So that portrays him as like a god-type figure.
So, Peter, who is King Billy in the minds of all of his supporters?
Well, in certain areas in the city, if God sits here, Billy sits about 3.5 inches above him. So that's how important he is.
Yeah. What do Catholics think about King Billy?
Would you like me to be honest? When I grew up, Billy was just a hate figure.
A hate figure?
He was a hate figure because, well, his army defeated the Catholic army.
Yeah.
The celebration, the Orange Men, July 12th, the bonfires, most Irish Catholics see it as the parades rubbing their nose in orange dog poop a couple of thousand times a year.
Yeah.
So for one side he's history and culture and identity, and the other side he is seen as a villain.
The troubles that scarred Britain and Ireland throughout the 20th century are a vivid reminder that there's never one definitive version of history, and that the past is always interpreted through the eyes of the present. In 1998, the people of Northern Ireland voted for change.
Yes, 71.12%.
The Good Friday Agreement came into force, and tensions finally began to ease. But 1688 still has a powerful place in Irish culture. In 2007, a Jacobite musket from the Battle of the Boyne made a rare public appearance. On a joint visit to the site of the Battle of the Boyne, Northern Ireland First Minister Ian Paisley and the Irish Prime Minister Bertie Ahern shared a photo opportunity with it. The gun became an unlikely prop in the peace process. 8 years later, the musket came up for auction here in Belfast. This deadly-looking thing was made at the Tower of London in 1685 for James II's army, hence the J2R on the side of it there. It was used by a dragoon, almost certainly at the Battle of the Boyne. A dragoon is a soldier who gets off his horse to fight, and he fires his carbine. This is a sort of short musket. As he does so, flames come out of the end of it, which look like the tongue of a dragon, which is why he's called a dragoon, and which explains the lovely little picture of a dragon on the side down here. At the auction, the gun was sold for a hefty £20,000 to an anonymous telephone bidder. Later it came out who this had been. It was the Museum of Orange Heritage. This Jacobite gun was bought by the very people against whom it had originally been fired. The museum was adding a new chapter to the tale of the Revolution. Exhibiting this Jacobite artifact in an orange institution can be seen as an attempt to bring the two opposing sides of history back together. The established account of William's glorious revolution, created in the 17th century and reinforced by later history makers, has cast a long shadow in Ireland. But now, some light is shining in.
Instead of reverberating to the roar of cannon fire, the charge of men, the shot of musket, or the clash of sword steel, today we have tranquility of still water, where we can contemplate the past and look forward to the future.
Invitation or invasion? Liberator or usurper? Triumph or treason? The story of the Glorious Revolution is still being written. One of the biggest fibs in British history. Next time, I'm in India, discovering how the British Crown reinvented the Raj in the 19th century. People often remember their history lessons as full of dates and battles, kings and queens, facts and figures. But the story of the past is open to interpretation. And much of British history is a carefully edited and even deceitful version of events. You might think that history is just a record of what happened. Actually, it's not like that at all. As soon as you do a little digging, you discover that it's more like a tapestry of different stories woven together by whoever was in power at the time. In this series, I'm going to debunk some of the biggest fibs in British history. In the 15th century, the story of the Wars of the Roses was invented by the Tudors to justify their power, and then immortalised by the greatest storyteller of them all, William Shakespeare.
Now is the winter of our discontent.
In the 17th century, politicians and artists helped turn a foreign invasion into the triumphal tale of Britain's glorious revolution. And in this programme, I'll discover how in the 19th century, a British government coup in India created the British Raj and was heralded by the Victorians as the civilising triumph of the empire.
In 1877, Queen Victoria got a promotion when she was made Empress of India. She was now up there with emperors like Alexander the Great or the Caesars, the most powerful potentates in history.
But Victoria's promotion wasn't just an expression of Britain's military might. With Victoria as its motherly figurehead, Britain was cooking up a new imperial vision. Tyranny and exploitation were things of the past. This would now be a caring empire, driven by core Victorian values of honour, respect and justice. Or so the story goes.
With history, the line between fact and fiction often gets blurred.
"20 years after Victoria became Empress of India, Britain staged an incredible spectacle. On the 22nd of June 1897, the nation celebrated her Diamond Jubilee. Victoria was now the longest-serving monarch in British history.
300,000 people had lined the streets to watch the Queen making her procession from Buckingham Palace all the way up here to St. Paul's Cathedral. Every minute of the day was very tightly timetabled. You could read in the newspapers exactly where she was supposed to be and when. She was supposed to get here at midday. Now, all these people had turned out because this was a rare chance to see the little old lady who'd led the nation for 60 years of unprecedented peace and prosperity. But perhaps even more importantly, this was a chance to celebrate the best thing that had ever happened to Britain, its empire.
Since Victoria's reign began in 1837, the British Empire had grown to become the largest and most powerful empire in the world. In 1897, Victoria ruled over 370 million subjects across the globe, and the jewel in the empire's crown was India.
Now, obviously, India brought prestige and wealth to the British Empire, but it did something else very important as well. It gave the British the opportunity to show other nations how imperialism should be done.
Victoria's Jubilee was a great excuse for a national slap on the back to celebrate Britain's imperial ideals of fair play, justice and honour. Little mentioned that the British were invaders in foreign lands, that India had been won by fighting bloody battles against Indian resistance.
This history of Victoria's reign was published in Jubilee year 1897, and the writer brings the story of empire right up into the present. He claims that all the Indian people in London for the Jubilee celebrations were delighted to be here. And what's more, they represented other happy Indians back at home. One felt, he writes, that each of them represented thousands more who were ready in the hour of peril to draw the sword for the motherland and its queen. He says that the Jubilee marks the high point of the imperial idea.
Now, you might be thinking, what a lot of nonsense. But this vision of India as the jewel in the crown of a benevolent empire was fervently believed by most Victorians. It had been carefully crafted since 1858, when the government had taken formal control of India. Queen Victoria herself had issued the new regime's imperial mission statement. We British will now wholeheartedly respect our Indian subjects. India will share all the benefits that have made our tiny island nation great. A history of aggressive conquest and exploitation was being moulded into an uplifting story to justify the empire. It began here in Kolkata, where the British had made their Indian base in the late 18th century.
Looking at a map of India, you might think that Kolkata, or Calcutta as it used to be known, is a bit of a funny place to choose for an imperial capital. It isn't bang in the middle like the really ancient city of Delhi. That was a much better place for dominating the subcontinent. But when the British first set up shop in the 18th century, they weren't intending to dominate the subcontinent at all. They'd come here to get rich through trade, and for that, Calcutta suited them perfectly.
Calcutta's Hooghly River flows out into the Bay of Bengal and into convenient sea routes to take goods back to Britain. But the first Britons to exploit India's riches here weren't members of the establishment. They were buccaneering, money-making entrepreneurs.
They were employees of a vast multinational corporation, the British East India Company.
The East India Company merchants first came to India in 1615, during the reign of Elizabeth I. Haggling with the local elite, these wheeler dealers gained a foothold in Calcutta and began to dominate trade in the region. This private company had no imperial ambitions and certainly no civilizing mission. For them, India was simply a cash cow to be plundered. Relying on trade deals with the local rulers, the company men now set about exploiting all the riches that India had to offer, from silks to cotton to tea to spices. This band of merchant adventurers stopped at nothing in their pursuit of wealth. Playing by their own rules, they reneged on trade deals. They refused to pay tribute to local rulers. And when they didn't get their way, resorted to violence. With their sharp trading practices, today these men seem little more than pirates. But the company didn't describe themselves as a bunch of bloodthirsty and avaricious merchants. No, these men were British and honourable to the core. The company's official title made this explicit. They called themselves the Honourable East India Company. And they went to great lengths to engineer a facade of British respectability. And they built monuments like this, an almost exact replica of the Church of St. Martin's in the Fields in Trafalgar Square. In fact, St. John's Church also housed the East India Company's first council chambers, where these Anglo-Indian merchants could discuss their real interests, making money. And they were quite successful. By the late 18th century, they were like independent rulers of large parts of India, with their own private army of Indian foot soldiers or sepoys. As the company grew in power, it still had its pretensions to that word honourable. But a rather different insight can be found inside St. John's. A picture by Johann Zoffany, the company's go-to portrait painter.
So, Jayanta, we're standing in a Christian church.
Yes.
We're looking at a painting of the Last Supper.
Yeah.
That's not such a surprising thing to find.
No, it's not. Except that Jesus and all the others present here are actually members of the fashionable Anglo-Indian society in Calcutta in the late 18th century.
So real people sat to have their pictures painted?
Yes. Jesus in the middle is a Greek bishop named Father Parthenio.
Yes.
To his left, the lady figure is actually the police sergeant of Calcutta in the late 18th century, named W.C. Blackware, who was a transvestite and who was very famous for stalking and rounding up criminals while dressed as a woman.
Hang on, you can't just say that. Are you saying that St. John is a transvestite policeman?
Here it is. That's Zoffany's funny take on this, slightly subversive.
Okay, and who else?
This bearded guy sitting on the right foreground with this dagger showing up on his waist, he's a Judas here. Oh. He's actually an auctioneer named William Tulloch.
He looks pretty unhappy.
He looks pretty pissed playing Judas here. All the others, they're all company men, powerful and influential.
Isn't this bordering on sacrilege, though? You've got to be pretty arrogant to depict yourself as an apostle.
I guess you can say that, but that arrogance comes from the actual power wielded by these people, because they are not only making money doing commerce, but they are also ruling the roost in politics and administration.
They called themselves the Honourable East India Company.
Yes.
They weren't honourable from our point of view today at all. How do you explain that?
Well, it's part of the self-image which the British created for themselves in order to feel good about their enterprise, which was really about commerce and money-making. And they were actually portrayed by fairly influential intellectuals at that time as honourable, like David Hume, whose volumes on the history of England portrays these people as very honourable, holding up the British values. And Hume actually says somewhere in those volumes that the reason why they could transform themselves so quickly from a trading enterprise into such a powerful political entity was the strength of their character.
Endorsed by the likes of David Hume, the company men ruled India with little accountability. And the British government was happy as long as the money kept rolling in. because the British East India Company profits enriched the British economy by £67 billion a year in today's money. But not everyone was impressed. In 1756, the local ruler of Bengal, Siraj ud-Dowlah, led an uprising against the East India Company. He captured Calcutta and locked a group of company men in a tiny prison called the Black Hole. Many died of suffocation. The British government would join the company to take terrible revenge, but only after presenting this event as a savage assault on Britain. The Black Hole of Calcutta was about to enter the history books.
To the memory of the 123 persons who perished in the Black Hole prison. Now, British people will have heard of the Black Hole of Calcutta, but what really was it?
Now, the only account of a survivor, of a first-hand account of that, is from a British general called John Holwell, who was in that room.
What sort of detail does he give us in his account?
John Holwell is fairly graphic in his details. I have an extract here from the Chambers Edinburgh Journal. This is Holwell's quote. The first effect of their confinement was a continued sweat, which soon produced intolerable thirst, succeeded by excruciating pains in the chest, with difficulty of breathing, little short of suffocation.
So this is a very graphic, horrific, dark story that he's telling.
True, this is very horrific. But what we know is that at that time it suited the British narrative.
Yes.
So they could not just come about and slaughter the natives, but their retribution, as ruthless and brutal as it was, had to be justified by some pre-existing Indian savagery or barbarism. It was more than 2 centuries later, in the 1960s, that Indian historians began to question Holwell's account for the first time. And the first one who did that very significantly was a historian named R.C. Majumdar, who wrote a book in 1962 where he raised 2 questions. One is that if it was so dark and so cramped in that little black hole, then how could Holwell write such a graphic description with such excruciating and horrific details? The other question was that if the room was so small, then there was no way you could cramp together 146 people in that. So even if Holwell were true about people dying of suffocation, it couldn't have been more than 60 or 70 people, not more. We don't know. Majumdar was a nationalist historian, so his account was also very subjective.
Was he trying to make the British look really bad? Like liars?
Yes.
Massagers of the truth?
But we don't know the real truth, what happened.
At the time, the facts, what really happened in the black hole, didn't matter to the company or the British government. They simply wanted to regain control. So a horror story was very useful in whipping up public support back home. And when the East India Company under General Robert Clive took their revenge, Clive's troops were reinforced by the might of the British Army at government expense. Clive was victorious. He was given a peerage and immortalised in the colonial narrative. He was now Clive of India. But British faith in the East India Company had been shaken.
The problem was that the company had stopped making a profit. Re-establishing control of Calcutta and Clive's other military manoeuvrings had cost an awful lot of money. The company had had to borrow money from the government, a lot of it. People at home were beginning to ask, was it worth it?
The company's honourable status was in doubt. While it was being bankrolled millions by the government, company men like Clive were getting rich and throwing their money around. For many, they were no longer seen as the best of British, but more like Oriental tyrants, corrupt and abusing their power. Clive had amassed a personal fortune of £4 million in today's money.
This immediately made him one of the richest men in the country. And But he wasn't alone. There were other ex-East India Company men coming back to Britain with these huge piles of cash. And they were ready to splash it about on buying property and power.
This is Season Coat in Gloucestershire, purchased in 1795 by a company man, Colonel John Cockrell. After his death, it was then embellished with this extravagant Indian facade by his brothers, also company men, Charles and Samuel.
The Cockrell family created a fantasy mini version of India here in the middle of the Cotswolds. From the inside, the house seems like a fairly standard Palladian villa. But on the outside, it's been given this fantastical Mughal coating. There are Muslim architectural features, like the green dome on the top and the minarets, and these very distinctive, deeply overhanging eaves. But then again, there are also Hindu features in the architecture, such as the octagonal columns each side of the door, and at the top of the columns, a little decoration of a lotus flower. But then again, on top of that, there are the architectural jokes in the corners above the arch up there. Well, we've got some Union Jacks. With its mashed up Muslim and Hindu features, a visitor from Georgian India would have thought there was something a bit odd about this place. But imagine what the Gloucestershire neighbours must have thought. To them, it must have looked totally alien.
Like many company men, the Cockerells had come back with delusions of grandeur to match their wallets. For the old establishment, these men were now seen as corrupt upstarts with ideas above their station. And in the popular press, they were satirised by cartoonists like James Gilray and labelled as nabobs, a perversion of the title Nawab, an Indian ruler.
Andrea, what was the problem with these East India men coming back to Britain? Why were they so disliked?
Well, part of it was a little bit of wealth envy. They were coming back with massive fortunes, buying their way into local society, throwing their money around. But it went a lot deeper than that. The main concern really was how they had got their money. So if we look at this cartoon, for example, it shows a sort of typical Nabob being carried through a sea of dead Indian bodies, clutching onto his money bags.
He's got £4 million in each hand. He's weighed down by his riches.
Absolutely.
And although he's got dying, drowning Indian people in the water, he's really bothered about not getting his slippers wet, isn't he?
This was the concern, that these nabobs were coming back, having spent their time in India, simply concerned with profit. So they're concerned that this money must be being acquired through sharp trading practices, through corruption, blackmail, speculation, profiteering, all of these kinds of dark arts that are seen to be closer to robbery than to fair trade.
How did the political establishment fight back against this?
Well, the main way they fought back was by impeaching the Governor-General, Warren Hastings. And we can see here, this is a very famous political cartoon of the time, which shows the political adversaries, Edmund Burke and Charles James Fox, uniting to try and take down Warren Hastings.
This is Warren Hastings, a Western ruler of Bengal, wearing Indian turban clothing. He's got his little slippers on again. And he is riding upon a strange creature.
I believe it's a camel.
It doesn't look much like a camel, but that's
slightly stylised camel, yes.
And he's representing the East India Company at this point, is he?
Yes, effectively. The bigger concerns here are not so much about Hastings as a person, but about what the East India Company is doing, how governance is being carried out in India. But of course, all of that is a little bit dry for capturing public opinion and public enthusiasm. And Burke realises that to have this debate, he needs to go for a target, and that target is Warren Hastings.
By company standards, Hastings wasn't the shadiest character by any means, but he was high profile, the perfect scapegoat for the government. He was charged with tyranny, robbery, corruption and blackmail. The trial dragged on for 7 years. In the end, it was impossible to make all the charges stick to one individual. Hastings was acquitted. But the show trial had worked. The East India Company had been discredited. The government was waking up to the dire situation in India. In future, company men would be kept in check.
In 1784, the government passed an act. Its full title makes it pretty clear what it was all about. It was an act for the better regulation of the affairs of the East India Company.
The cosy relationship between the company and the British establishment was on the turn. The merry band of merchants were now depicted as rather too merry. Drunkards who'd succumbed to the vices of the Orient and grown too close to the locals and their culture.
Take, for example, the rather fabulously named James Achilles Kirkpatrick. This is his memorial in St. John's Church. He was a lieutenant colonel for the company, and he had a Muslim wife and Muslim children. There was a boy, Ghulam Ali, and a girl, Noor an-Nisa. He was obviously perfectly happy with the situation.
But not everybody was. Shortly before Kirkpatrick's death, his children came to live in England.
And there they were given new names for their new life. Here's the record of their baptism. Ghulam Ali became William George, and Noor an-Nisa became Catherine Aurora. Must have been confusing for the poor kids.
As the enforced conversion of his children from Islam to Christianity reveals, some company men, like Kirkpatrick, had more enlightened views about race and religion than the British establishment. At the end of the 18th century, the government began to think that the company was growing degenerate, corrupted by the influence of native religions. The most dangerous of all, Hinduism. Hindus made up 90% of the 250 million strong Indian population. The British called the country India, but its ancient native name was Hindustan, land of the Hindus.
Ever since the British had arrived in India, they'd struggled to understand Hinduism. With its, to them, exotic gods and goddesses, more than 1 million of them, and its confusing caste system. But at least the earlier visitors in the 18th century had had a go at appreciating it. For example, the Scottish historian William Robertson thought that Hinduism expressed the sophistication of Indian culture. He wrote that the Indian people had made more progress towards civilization than any other people.
Robertson's opinions reflected a certain 18th century view of India's culture as exotic, fascinating, even praiseworthy. By the 19th century, though, many British people reviled Hinduism. The ancient custom of sati, for example, of burning a man's widow after his death, seemed shocking. It had been East India Company policy not to rock the boat, not to interfere with native beliefs. But now the British establishment was taking a very different view.
Historians were now totally disrespectful of Indian culture. In fact, they were horrified by it. For example, James Mill wrote a wildly successful history of India, and he doesn't have a good word to say about Hindus. He thinks they're full of antisocial passions and malignity, but at the same time, they're cowards. This people run from danger with more trepidation and eagerness than has been ever witnessed in any other part of the globe. The funny thing was that James Mill had never been to India. He probably hadn't even met a Hindu. And then we have the evangelical historian Charles Grant. He too thinks that the natives are extremely depraved, but Mr. Grant has a solution. He thinks it's the introduction of our light and knowledge among that benighted people, especially the pure, salutary, wise principles of our religion. Grant's history became a Bible for missionaries. And James Mill's, well, that became the standard textbook for any young company official going out to India. In fact, Mill was even employed back in Britain to oversee the education of new recruits.
The anti-Hindu propaganda in these history books helped justify the government's assault on the East India Company. It opened the way for more direct meddling in the affairs of India. The British government claimed that they were protecting company men from further pollution by immoral practices. And in 1811, When the government gave missionaries the license to preach in India, they thought the natives would be grateful for their conversion to Christianity. But in 1857, that comforting fiction went up in flames. In March of that year, resistance to the British erupted amongst the Indian soldiers. Over the next 15 months, bitter fighting broke out with heavy military and civilian casualties on both sides. India became a bloodbath. The East India Company's hold on the country was falling apart.
This is the Enfield Pattern 1853 rifle. It was a state-of-the-art weapon. It had performed very well for the British Army in the Crimean War. So when the East India Company's army needed new guns in 1856, this is the model they chose. Unfortunately, they were shooting themselves in the foot. The problem was the cartridges. They were lubricated with tallow, that's animal fat, either pork or beef. To load the gun, you have to bite the end off the cartridge, like this, and out comes the powder. Now, that's not very nice for anybody to have to do. And the majority of the soldiers in the East India Company army were either Hindus or Muslims. To them, it was sacrilegious, because for Hindus, the cow is a holy animal, and Muslims are forbidden to eat pork.
As wave after wave of rebellion spread across the subcontinent, the cartridges became a rallying point for Indian resistance to the British and their disregard for Indian religions and culture.
For the Indian soldiers, this business of the cartridges was important because it was tangible. It focused their grievances. For the British, though, it was used to bolster the fiction that this was a purely military matter. It wasn't part of wider discontent. This was simply an Indian mutiny.
By describing the uprising as a mutiny, a military matter, the British were trying to control the story.
Like the Black Hole incident 100 years before, the situation seemed to call for swift, sharp retribution. If this was painted as soldiers disobeying orders or a military mutiny, then a brutal response was justified.
This is Barrackpur, just outside modern Kolkata. In Hindi, Barrackpur means the city of barracks. And in 1857, this was the site of an East India Company army base. The Indian uprising began here, as did the British decision to call it a mutiny. I'm going to see the statue of an Indian soldier who's said to have started the rebellion, Mangal Pandey.
It was 29th of March, 1857, that he came out of his barracks with his red coat, the hat, but significantly not the pantaloon, but the traditional Indian dhoti.
Oh, so the top half was British,
yeah,
and the bottom half was Indian.
That might be indicative of something, you know.
Something's
that
going
I'm
on.
going to revolt against the British.
And what happened?
Then one of the British officers came forward, but Mangal Pandey shot him, but he missed. The second British officer came and he ordered the sepoys to come out to help them. But most of the, Indian sepoys, they didn't, come out to help him.
Nobody came.
Yeah,
the other sepoys didn't come.
No, didn't come.
Yeah.
Then the third officer, who was the commanding officer, he came and he called the sepoys to come out or he will shoot them. Then the sepoys came, but when Mangal Pandey saw that, then he shot himself. He was injured seriously and he was arrested, and after that he was hanged under this banyan tree.
It sounds to me like this really was technically a mutiny. He broke the rules of being a soldier.
Yeah, in the British eyes, of course, he did. But from the Indian point of view, this was a just thing. It is the result of the colonial exploitation of India by the British.
And when did Indian historians themselves start to come out with their own version of what happened?
It was a person called V.D. Savarkar who wrote a book in the early 20th century, and the name of the book is First War of Independence. Now here also, not Indian Mutiny or Indian Revolt, Indian War of Independence. Still now, in school books, and in textbooks in the colleges, Mangal Pandey is regarded as the first martyr of the Indian independence movement.
Do you think that this whole event, call it a mutiny, a war, whatever you like, it's a really fascinating case study for historians, isn't it?
Sure, it is. You have to see the whole thing in the perspective of the time.
Visiting Barrackpur today, with the crumbling ruins of the military barracks around the cherished memorial to Mangal Pandey, history is on the side of the sepoys. But in 1857, it was a very different story. Back then, today's heroic freedom fighter was portrayed by the British establishment as a drug-crazed villain, disobeying orders, the ringleader of a mutiny. As the resistance quickly spread across the country, Remember Mangal Pandey became the Indian resistance cry. And for the British, Pandey became a byword for mutineer. The killing on both sides was ferocious. For the British, the crisis point came in June 1857, when Indian rebels at Cawnpore killed over 200 British women and children. They then dumped their bodies in a well. Once again, the British began whipping up a frenzy for vengeance. The scene of the Cawnpore slaughter was deliberately left untouched to provoke the bloodlust of the relief forces.
For instance, we have this shoe that survives, and it was found near the well at Cawnpur.
So the story goes that this little shoe fell off the foot of a dead little boy as his body was being thrown down the well for disposal.
That's right.
Do you see this as a sort of a prop for telling a particular story about what happened on that day, then?
I certainly think so. I think if this was a soldier's boot, it wouldn't have had the same impact. It's a child shoe.
It's a really powerful thing to see, isn't it?
It's emotive. It's telling you they're not just attacking our men, they're attacking our women, they're attacking our children. It goes further with another object that is linked to the same incident. A lock of hair that is in our collection. Have a quick read of the inscription.
The little note says, hair of the murdered women and children, over 200 of them.
But another account tells us of the Highlanders that arrived at the well of Cawnpur and vowed to themselves that for every strand of hair that we find, a mutineer shall die.
Oh, my goodness.
The message was revenge, justification for revenge.
The message was received, loud and clear, and the British retribution was merciless. To show people at home that vengeance had been done, it was then graphically recorded.
This watercolour is a depiction of mutineers being blown away. They're tied to the mouths of cannons and then blown to pieces.
So the cannonball is about to come out through the middle of him?
Quite gruesome. You see, typically, reports say the head goes up, the arms go to the side, and the legs fall.
Why were they killed in such an inhumane manner?
It was something used by the Mughals in the 1600s, which was really aimed at punishing Hindu people so that they wouldn't have a body in their afterlife and therefore couldn't go through the reincarnation cycle that they believed in.
So the scattering of the physical remains of the person, this ensured a kind of double death in this life and for all future lives to come.
Certainly so. And that's one of the reasons why this is probably painted, and it was a way of stamping authority and showing victory.
By the time the British finally crushed the rebellion in July 1859, conservative estimates say that 11,000 British and over 100,000 Indians had died. The British were victorious, but India was in turmoil. Since the unrest had started, the government had begun to realise that India couldn't be held by brute force alone. Britain needed to start winning over Indian hearts and minds. The government decided to begin a new chapter for British rule in India. In 1858, the East India Company were told, "You're fired."
Now, when the government had intervened previously in the business of the East India Company, It had been with the aim of moderating its affairs. Sometimes there'd been a bit of a slap on the wrist. But this time, it was different. This was a full-on, asset-stripping annihilation of the East India Company.
It was immediately stripped of all power. The company's top dog, the Governor-General, was evicted from his palatial residence and sent home, to be replaced by a new government representative, the Viceroy. The new age of the Raj was dawning. The government now had to prove that the regime in India really had changed, and was already weaving an imperial narrative to do just that.
To avoid accusations of corruption or self-interest, power wasn't transferred directly to Parliament. Instead, it was vested in the person of Queen Victoria herself.
Victoria eagerly got in on the act. She made a public proclamation to the world that the new regime had swept away all the bad practices of the old East India Company.
We will respect the rights, dignity and honour of the native princes. Everyone of any religious faith shall alike enjoy the equal and impartial protection of law. We will respect land inherited from ancestors. Our earnest desire is to stimulate the peaceful industry of India, to promote public works and improvements. Their prosperity will be our strength.
Victoria's proclamation was a masterstroke. It transformed the government coup into a moral mission to improve the lives of all Indians. The new declaration distanced the British establishment from any involvement in the East India Company's atrocities. Britain's image as a plundering nation was now being repackaged for both Indian audiences and those back home.
In this 18th century image, Britannia is taking things from the empire. She's saying, jewels, I want them. And even her lion is looking greedily at the ropes of pearls. But in the 19th century image, the relationship is the other way round. In this picture, Victoria is giving something to her grateful imperial subject. Look, this lucky fellow is about to get a present. And this, as the title of the painting puts it, is the secret of England's greatness.
Britain's new imperial mission statement was clear. The empire would take responsibility for the welfare of its Indian subjects. They would no longer be subjugated and exploited, but respected and rewarded. That would smooth things over.
In 1861, a new knightly order was created, the Order of the Star of India. When the Indian princes were made Knights Commander of this order, they were supposed to feel like they joined the British establishment, a bit like school prefects getting given a badge. But they were also given at this point a medal showing the head of Queen Victoria. Now, hang on. Human representations can be offensive to Muslims, as many of the princes were. Once again, the British were merrily misunderstanding their Indian subjects.
In reality, the replacement of East India Company rule with the British Raj offered only a veneer of change. Beneath the surface, the British government was continuing to exploit India's riches. But this message that the empire was now all about civilization was very powerful. And in 1868, this imperial manifesto gained another powerful champion, the new Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli. He coined the phrase, the jewel in the crown, to emphasize his view of India's importance for the empire.
Disraeli was highly ambitious, partly for himself, yes, but also for Britain and for the empire. He thought that Britain shouldn't just maintain its empire, it should expand, and that for this purpose, a figurehead, like an empress, would be awfully useful.
In 1876, Disraeli engineered the Royal Titles Act, giving his imperial jewel some extra sparkle. Queen Victoria would become the Empress of India.
This was a very clever move on Disraeli's part. Ever since Albert had died in 1861, Victoria had been in mourning. she'd rather withdrawn from the world, and her people thought that she'd forgotten about them, almost that she'd been shirking her responsibilities. But now, she was back in the limelight.
The imperial narrative now had a powerful yet maternal leading lady. Disraeli enjoyed his own promotion too, as the delighted Victoria made him an earl. But Victoria's elevation didn't have unanimous approval. Many thought the title of Empress stank of autocratic rule. It was against the principles of constitutional monarchy. And besides, what would the Indian population think? Disraeli and his supporters needed to spin a story to prove that Victoria's promotion was best for Britain, best for India, best for the Empire. What was needed was a party, and that's exactly what they got.
Lord Lytton, who was Queen Victoria's newly promoted representative in India, expressed the opinion that Indians would go mad for a bit of bunting.
There were immense cultural differences, but both Indians and the British revelled in pageantry and spectacle. Celebrations were to be held across India, and there would be one show-stopping event.
It was decided that the celebrations weren't to be in Calcutta, but here in Delhi. Because this wasn't just a party, this was a cleverly crafted statement of propaganda.
The choice of Delhi was highly symbolic. For centuries, Delhi had been the capital of the great ruling Indian dynasty, the Mughals. It was still full of magnificent buildings signifying their power.
By situating themselves amidst all this grandeur, the British were claiming that they were the natural successors to a mighty empire.
Delhi had also played a central role in the so-called mutiny. The rebels had made their stand alongside the last Mughal emperor, here in his Red Fort.
By holding the celebrations in Delhi, the British were reminding the Indians of their dominance.
The British couldn't deny that they were foreign interlopers, but they now hammered home the message that they were a benign force for good. To appeal to the Indians, the entire event took the form of a durbar, a tradition where Mughal emperors held court with their subjects. These formal ceremonies were accompanied by lavish festivities, with vibrant musical processions leading to the final audience with the emperor at his fort. In 1877, the British created their own Durbar Spectacular, with an extraordinary mishmash of Indian and British pageantry.
When the Darbar of 1877 happens, the idea of a Darbar is retained, but it's given a spin. I'm saying that the Darbar of 1877 reminds me a little of the chicken tikka masala, which incidentally I ate for the first time when I went to England. It's not something that featured in Indian menus till quite recently. So the idea of a chicken tikka masala is an invention based on three staples taken from an Indian diet, but turned and transformed into a completely unrecognizable dish.
How did the British go about reinventing this tradition?
For example, the Shehnai players that would have traditionally accompanied a royal procession in Mughal India were replaced by a fanfare of Wagner. And I would imagine that the 88,000 people who had gathered to watch the spectacle and the 63 Maharajas who'd come from different parts of the country to be a part of the Darbar had possibly never heard of Wagner playing. Lots of things were invented. For example, look at these. Many of the rulers did not really have their own heraldry, their own insignia. This is completely the figment of somebody's imagination.
So this is a brand new coat of arms invented for the ruler of Hyderabad.
Completely.
He's lucky he's got a lovely little tiger.
He does indeed. These seem to me very Anglo-Saxon images.
Because the tradition of heraldry, that's a Western European thing. What have the other ones got then?
This is Jodhpur. This goes with him. This is Jodhpur.
He has been given some pigeons.
These are falcons. Again, falcons.
Yes.
And what looks like a tiger, but I'm not sure what that is. But this is, again, invented tradition. These are things that were invented for the occasion.
In 1877, with Wagner trumpeting out over the spectacle, the Durbar was a resounding success story. It was spun so cleverly that few commented on its vast costs, at a time when famine was ravaging India. The money could have been spent on saving the 5.5 million Indians who died from starvation. But no, this was the climax to the positive story that the Raj was a wonderful new age of empire.
At the finale, a proclamation was read out. It was from the Queen. "We trust," it began, she's using the royal we, "that the present occasion may tend to unite in bonds of close affection ourselves and our subjects. That from the highest to the humblest, all may feel that under our rule, the great principles of liberty, equity, and justice are secured to them. This is the object of our empire."
Every action was now heralded as part of the civilizing narrative. Train stations and railways would modernize this ancient, disconnected territory as never before. And new educational institutions would offer every Indian subject the chance to improve his or her lot.
Educating the natives was a key part of the mission of empire, at least according to Thomas Babington Macaulay, politician and historian. Macaulay thought that Indian schoolboys ought to study British history, because that would show them how a society could and should develop. Britain showcased the triumphant march of progress.
Macaulay first expressed his educational policies in the 1830s. He thought that with a good dose of education, Indians could not only better themselves, but help the British run the country. Of course, they'd have to get the right sort of education. Not Indian, but British.
Macaulay thought that there was less valuable historical information to be collected from all the books ever written in Sanskrit than you would find in an English prep school textbook. Macaulay believed that a native could only be called learned or honourable if he'd learnt his Milton, his Locke, and his Isaac Newton.
Giving Indians British educational opportunities became a key enterprise under Crown rule. It was central to the repackaging of the empire. But for the people of India, the new educational policy exposed the civilizing claims of the British to be something of a sham.
The Indians, the educated Indians, they had started realizing that they had been sort of tricked by the British imperialists, because while the Queen, the proclamation of the Queen, had spoken of equality, there remained a lot of discrimination between the British and the Indians, insofar as jobs were concerned.
What sort of jobs were these educated Indians hoping to get?
They wanted to hold important posts in the civil services. Moreover, they wanted to hold important positions in the realm of law. But here there was a bar. Indian judges, they were never allowed to try an European offender. The European offender was exclusively tried by a British judge or an European judge.
So we have the rhetoric of empire,
yes,
very clear, but
yes,
the reality is quite different.
It was definitely different. There was a glass ceiling, and beyond that limit, the Indians could not cross over.
In 1883, there was a move to smooth over the cracks. C.P. Ilbert, a member of the Calcutta Law Council, put forward a motion to give Indian judges the right to try British individuals. But that didn't go down very well either.
It disturbed the Anglo-Indian community because they shuddered at the very thought of their trial under an Indian, a brown judge. So there was a white mutiny against the Ilbert Bill, and ultimately the bill was defeated.
Would you say that the Ilbert Bill then was the last straw for educated Indians? They got fed up with the empire?
Yes, that was the last straw on the camel's back.
For many newly educated Indians, the rejection of the Ilbert Bill was evidence that Victoria's proclamation was little more than a pack of lies. The imperial mission was having a rough ride in India, but one person remained true to the new story of a benign British Empire.
Yes, the Empress of India was very partial to a chicken tikka. Victoria may never have visited the jewel in her crown, but she did create a tiny slice of India on the Isle of Wight. At her holiday home of Osborne House, she created a special Indian room, the Durbar Room. It was put together by Indian craftsmen under the supervision of Rudyard Kipling's grandfather.
Victoria couldn't go to her Durbar, but with her new room, the Durbar had come to her. And she was far better informed about India than most of her British subjects. In the late 19th century, most Britons had never met anybody from the subcontinent. But a growing number of Indians were now making Britain their home. In 1889, Britain's first purpose-built mosque was constructed to cater for this growing Indian population in Woking. And it's here that I'm meeting Shrabani Basu, who's researched the life of a man who fired up Victoria's passion for India, Abdul Karim.
Here we've got Abdul Karim looking terribly grand. What are all these medals that he's wearing here?
Well, she gave him land and titles. He had every title, just stopped short of a knighthood, actually.
He's quite the aristocrat in his sort of study, at ease, looking extremely distinguished, if I might
Absolutely.
be
And
so
there's a
bold.
photo of Queen Victoria there.
And a photo with the Queen on the table there. Is he just a sort of token gesture to bolster the idea that she's this benign Empress of India?
You know, it started like that. He was sent to her as a Jubilee present, as a servant, to stand behind her at table, just look grand, and wait on her. But this relationship developed. Within a year, he's become her private teacher, her munshi. And for 13 years, he taught her Urdu. And by the end of her life, she could read and write Urdu. She loved showing off. She would invite royalty from India and, you know, say a few lines in Urdu.
Is this her own private journal?
This is actually her last entry in her journal. It's quite moving because it's written 2 months before her death, November 7th, 1900, Windsor Castle. And she writes about the weather, that she's just got back from Balmoral.
They weren't exactly talking about high politics. Sounds more domestic.
It is. The journals show a domestic side, but we know that she took a keen interest in Indian politics. And this is coming from Abdul because of the letters she writes to the Viceroy, in which she asks detailed questions about riots, tension between Hindus and Muslims, and she even offers some solutions. She says, the Hindus have so many festivals. Why can't they just postpone one of their festivals so they don't clash during Muharram? And the poor Viceroy, Lord Lansdowne, he writes back, postponing a Hindu festival would be like changing the day for Christmas. So she's a little bit naive, but she's trying very hard.
Victoria was taking her symbolic empress role rather too literally, and the British establishment were not amused.
The doctor, he actually writes that this is all munshi mania, and it reaches a stage where they actually want to label the Queen insane, and they say, we will, if you don't stop now because of the munshi, we will say you are insane. And then she gives them a earful.
Victoria's Munshi mania reached its peak in 1897, the year of her Diamond Jubilee. On the day of the celebrations, Abdul Karim was her honoured guest. For his dismayed detractors, this was the year of the Munshi, but things would very shortly change. In 1901, Victoria, Empress of India, died after 63 years on the throne. at the age of 81. While the nation mourned her passing, in recognition that she'd nurtured the empire towards unprecedented greatness, her beloved Abdul Karim was finally put in his place by the establishment, sent back to India, stripped of his honours and gifts. As Britain entered the 20th century, the empire was strong, but the imperial narrative was wearing thin. Indian resistance to British power was growing, and even some Britons began to question the recent history of the Raj.
One historian, who'd formerly been an ardent imperialist, had this to say. He said that the empire treated its subject races with a curious mixture of good and evil.
The stories of the Black Hole of Calcutta and the Indian Mutiny were being rewritten. The villains of the Raj were turning into heroes of a growing nationalist movement. When the British gave up control of the Indian subcontinent on August the 15th, 1947, Britain lost 80% of its subjects, nearly 390 million people. Its jewel in the crown had gone forever. And as the new Indian flag was raised at the Red Fort in Delhi, India's first Prime Minister, Pandit Nehru, spoke of India's tryst with destiny. History begins anew for us, the history which we shall live and act and others will write about. A richly embroidered chapter in British history was at an end.
In this series, I've tried to tell you how stories from history change according to who's telling them. But don't think that I've given you the definitive version, because I promise you that in years to come, a different historian will be telling you a different tale.